Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. We were halfway through our road trip when the GPS stopped working. It was the middle of nowhere, nothing but fields and thick trees on either side. The sun was setting, and my wife, Hannah, kept telling me to turn back, but I insisted we could figure it out. The map on my phone wasn't loading, and the only sign we'd seen in the last half hour was an old, rusted one pointing toward a place called Hollister. I figured it was a small town. Gas, directions, and maybe some snacks for the kids in the back seat. What could go wrong? The road turned to gravel after a few miles. It wasn't a big deal at first, but then the gravel turned to dirt, and the trees got closer. The kids started complaining, and even I started feeling uneasy, but it was too late to turn around. Finally, we saw lights ahead. A cluster of old houses and a single gas station came into view. It wasn't much, but it was something. The gas station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. One pump, peeling paint, and an old man sitting out front in a rocking chair. He stared at us as we pulled in, didn't wave or smile. Just stared. I went inside to ask for directions, leaving Hannah and the kids in the car. The guy behind the counter was younger, maybe in his 30s. He had this hollow look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him how to get back to the main road, but he just stared at me for a long time before saying, "You shouldn't be here." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke, but he didn't smile. He leaned in closer and whispered, "Turn around and go back the way you came. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone." I didn't know what to say. His tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. I bought a soda just to avoid more awkwardness and went back to the car. When I told Hannah what he'd said, she told me to listen to him. I was about to when the old man from the rocking chair walked over. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was rough, like gravel, and his eyes never left mine. I nodded, told him we were trying to find the main road. He glanced at the kids in the back seat, then at Hannah, and smiled a crooked, toothless grin. "You'll want to take the road up past the church," he said. "It'll get you where you need to go." Hannah whispered for me to ignore him, but I felt stuck. I thanked him and got back in the car. Against her protests, I drove toward the church. The dirt road twisted and turned, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. The church was small and looked abandoned. The windows were broken, and the front door hung open. That's when I noticed them, 3 or 4 people standing by the side of the road, just watching us. They didn't wave or call out, just stood there, staring. "Don't stop," Hannah said, gripping my arm. I didn't plan to. I drove past them, but they turned to follow us with their eyes. One of them, a man in overalls, stepped into the road behind us and just stood there, watching as we drove away. We kept going, but the road didn't lead anywhere. After another 20 minutes, it just ended at a clearing. There was no way out. Hannah started panicking, telling me we needed to turn around and go back the way we came. The kids were crying, and I was trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I turned the car around. When we got back to the church, the people were gone. The sun had set completely by then, and the only light was from our headlights. That's when we saw it, a truck parked across the road, blocking our path. The same man in overalls stood next to it, holding something in his hand. I slowed down but didn't stop. The man didn't move. As we got closer, I saw what he was holding, a shotgun. Hannah screamed, and I slammed on the brakes. The man walked toward us, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I threw the car into reverse, but as soon as I did, another truck pulled up behind us. We were trapped. The kids were screaming now, and Hannah was begging me to do something. I didn't know what to do. The man with the shotgun tapped on the hood of our car with the barrel, motioning for me to roll down the window. I cracked it an inch, just enough to hear him. "Get out," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. "Leave the car and get out." I shook my head, tried to explain that we were lost and didn't mean any harm, but he wasn't listening. "Get out," he repeated. Hannah grabbed my arm and whispered, "Hit him. Go." I didn't think. I just slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, hitting the man. He rolled onto the hood and fell to the ground. I swerved around the first truck and sped down the road, not caring where it led as long as it was away from there. The truck behind us gave chase. Its headlights filled the car, and I could hear the engine roaring as it got closer. The road was too narrow and winding for me to go fast, but I didn't dare slow down. They rammed us. The car jolted, and the kids screamed. Hannah was yelling at me to keep going, but the road was getting rougher, and I was losing control. Up ahead, I saw a break in the trees. A highway. I pushed the car as hard as I could, swerving onto the pavement just as the truck tried to hit us again. It missed, skidding into a ditch. I didn't stop. I drove until we saw the lights of a diner and pulled into the parking lot. Inside, I called the police. When they arrived, they took our statement but said there wasn't much they could do. The town we'd been in didn't even appear on their maps. We ended the trip early and went home the next day. For weeks, I couldn't sleep, replaying the night over and over in my head. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: we weren't supposed to leave. It was late, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m., when my car broke down on Route 17. I was headed back home after visiting my sister, and it was one of those stretches of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, and my phone had barely a single bar of service. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of sitting there all night wasn't exactly comforting. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was looking at. I didn't. Everything seemed fine to me, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was new, and I had gas, so I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I saw the headlights. They came up slow, like whoever was driving was being careful. I stood by my car, waving my arms to make sure they saw me. A truck pulled over to the side, an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. The driver got out, a tall man with a thick build, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had a calm, steady way about him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice deep and even. "My car just died," I said. "I can't figure out what's wrong, and my phone's not working." He nodded and walked over to my car without another word. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with a couple of things while I stood off to the side. After a minute, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Looks like it might be the fuel pump," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. What should I do? "Well," he said, "I've got a garage not far from here. I can tow you there. Take a closer look." I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. It was either him or wait for someone else to come by, and who knew how long that would take. "All right," I said finally. He went back to his truck and pulled out a tow chain, hooking it up to my car. The whole time, he didn't say much. I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived nearby, but his answers were short, almost clipped. The ride to his garage wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. We turned off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. There weren't any lights except for his headlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. I started to regret my decision, but it was too late to back out. The garage was a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a single overhead light that flickered. He unhooked my car and waved me toward the entrance. "Come on in," he said. "I'll take a look." I followed him inside, and my unease grew. The place was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and a thick layer of dust. There was a smell, too oil mixed with something sour. He motioned for me to sit on a worn-out chair near the wall while he pulled the hood of my car open again. I tried to stay calm, but the way he moved felt off. He wasn't really looking at the engine, just sort of going through the motions. I noticed his eyes darting toward me every so often, like he was checking to see if I was watching him. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked suddenly. "No," I said. "Why?" "Just making conversation," he said, his tone flat. I shifted in my seat, feeling the tension in the air. I glanced toward the door, calculating how far I'd have to run to get to it if something went wrong. He closed the hood and turned to face me. "Fuel pump shot," he said. "I can order the part, but it'll take a day or two." "I can call someone to pick me up," I said, standing. "Thanks for your help." "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold now. "Your phone doesn't work, remember?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. I forced myself to smile, trying to act like I wasn't scared. "I'll just wait outside," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're staying here," he said. "It's not safe out there at night." My heart was pounding now. I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and his eyes had a strange intensity. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't. Instead, he pulled me back toward the chair and pushed me into it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I twisted out of his grip and ran for the door. He shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop. I made it outside and sprinted toward the trees. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He was faster than I expected, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. He stopped nearby, his footsteps slowing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and angry. He walked past my hiding spot, and I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I moved. I crept through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older woman, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. She drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They found my car at the garage, but the man was gone. They said the place had been abandoned for years, and they'd had reports of strange activity in the area before. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again. I had been driving for hours, the kind of stretch where your eyes start to burn, and the road blurs into a black ribbon. It was late, probably after midnight, and I just wanted to get home. When I saw the rest stop sign, I figured it'd be smart to pull over, use the bathroom, and maybe splash some water on my face. The parking lot was empty except for a beat-up sedan parked crooked near the far edge. The light from the building was dim, flickering like it hadn't been maintained in years. I almost didn't stop, but my bladder had other plans. I parked close to the entrance and walked in, the sound of my boots echoing on the tile. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. The restroom was down a narrow hallway, and as I pushed the door open, I noticed it creaked like in those old horror movies. The place reeked of bleach and mildew. A single bulb buzzed overhead, casting weird shadows on the walls. There were 3 stalls and 2 urinals, one of which had a caution tape across it. I picked the cleanest stall and did my business quickly. When I came out, there was a man standing by the sinks. He was tall, lanky, with greasy hair that clung to his forehead. He was wearing a faded jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. His back was to me, and he was staring at the mirror, but I could tell he wasn't looking at himself. "Hey," he said without turning around. His voice was flat, almost too calm. Hey," I replied, trying to sound casual. I moved to the sink farthest from him to wash my hands. "You haven't seen a phone around, have you?" he asked, finally turning to look at me. His eyes were dark, sunken, and they didn't blink as much as they should have. "No, sorry," I said. "I just got here." He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me. "Weird," he muttered. "I'm sure I dropped it in here somewhere." I grabbed a paper towel and dried my hands quickly, ready to leave. "Good luck finding it," I said, heading for the door. "Wait." His voice stopped me cold. It wasn't loud, but there was something in the tone that made my skin crawl. I turned halfway, not wanting to engage but not wanting to seem rude. "Yeah. Can you help me look?" He stepped closer, blocking my path to the door. His hands were stuffed in his jacket pockets, and the way he stood, leaning slightly forward, felt wrong. "I really need to get going," I said, trying to sidestep him, but he didn't move. "You sure you didn't see it?" His tone sharpened, like he was accusing me. "It's a black phone. Real shiny. You wouldn't lie, would you?" I shook my head, keeping my voice steady. "No, I wouldn't. I didn't see anything." He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that showed too many teeth and didn't reach his eyes. "You seem nervous," he said. "Why are you nervous?" I felt my chest tighten. "I'm not nervous," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I just need to get back on the road." He didn't move. "You're in a hurry, huh? What's the rush? You got somewhere important to be?" His voice dropped lower, and I noticed his hands tightening into fists inside his pockets. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I said. My heart was pounding now. I could hear it in my ears. "Trouble?" he repeated, tilting his head. "Who said anything about trouble?" I took a step back, but the wall was right behind me. He took a step forward, closing the distance. I could smell him now, sweat and something sour, like old cigarettes. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's funny how people always think they're safe at places like this. But no one's really safe. Not out here." My mind raced. I glanced at the door, calculating if I could shove past him, but he was too close. If he had a weapon, I wouldn't stand a chance. "Listen," I said, trying to sound firm, "I'm leaving. Move out of the way." His smile vanished. He stood there, staring at me like he was deciding something. Then, without warning, he pulled his hands out of his pockets. One was empty, but the other held a small, rusted knife. "You're not going anywhere," he said. I didn't think. I shoved him as hard as I could, catching him off balance. He stumbled back, and I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the handle, but I managed to yank it open. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding on the tile. I sprinted down the hallway, my boots slipping on the floor. When I burst into the parking lot, I didn't even look back. I jumped into my car, locking the doors as fast as I could. He came out seconds later, standing under the flickering light. The knife was still in his hand, and his face was twisted with rage. He started walking toward my car. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed out of the spot. He broke into a run, slamming his hands on the hood as I turned the wheel and hit the gas. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. My phone finally got a signal, and I called the police. They said they'd send someone to check the rest stop, but I didn't stick around to find out what happened next. I kept driving, the man's face burned into my memory. Even now, I can still hear his voice, low and calm, saying those words, "No one's really safe." I was sitting in the middle row of the theater, halfway through a thriller movie, when the fire alarm went off. It wasn't just a beep, it was the loud, piercing kind that makes your heart jump. The screen went dark, and the house lights flickered on. People started murmuring and looking around. No smoke, no flames, just a blaring alarm. A few ushers ran down the aisles, waving their hands and shouting for everyone to head to the exits. I grabbed my bag and followed the crowd. The main doors were a bottleneck, with everyone pushing and shoving. I decided to try the emergency exit near the screen instead. It wasn't a big crowd at the theater that night, so only a couple of others were heading that way. I figured it'd be faster. The hallway behind the emergency door was dimly lit and felt colder than it should have been. The exit sign was glowing red at the far end. I moved quickly, my sneakers squeaking on the tiled floor, but when I reached the door, it didn't budge. I pushed harder, then tried pulling. Nothing. Locked. I said aloud, my voice bouncing off the walls. I turned back and saw that the others who had followed me were already gone. Maybe they'd gone back to the main exit. I felt the unease start creeping in. The alarm was still going, muffled now by the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man in a uniform. He came from the direction I just walked, his footsteps echoing. He looked like security, dark pants, a matching jacket, and a radio clipped to his belt. "Need help?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost too calm for the situation. "Yeah," I said. "This door's locked. Shouldn't it open during an alarm?" He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head like he was sizing me up. "Sometimes they malfunction," he said. "I can help you find another way out." I nodded, relieved. He motioned for me to follow, and I did, though something about him felt off. His uniform wasn't quite right, no patches, no name tag. His boots looked more like work boots than the kind security guards wear. As we walked, he kept glancing back at me. His eyes were dark and sharp, like he was studying me instead of the surroundings. I slowed down, letting a bit more distance grow between us. "Where are we going?" I asked. "There's another exit at the back," he said, without turning around. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, and the lights seemed dimmer now. I didn't hear anyone else, no voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the alarm in the distance. "Are you sure?" I asked again. He stopped abruptly and turned to face me. His face was blank, but his eyes were intense, like he was daring me to question him again. "Do you want to get out or not?" he asked. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I nodded but didn't move closer. He turned back around and started walking again, slower this time, like he was waiting for me to follow. I glanced over my shoulder, wondering if I should just run back the way I came, but the hallway behind me seemed darker now. I took a deep breath and followed, keeping my steps light. A few minutes later, we reached a door. He pushed it open, and I expected to see the parking lot or another part of the theater, but it was just another hallway, narrower than the last. "This doesn't feel right," I said, stopping in my tracks. He turned around again, this time with a faint smirk on his face. "You don't trust me?" I didn't answer. I glanced at his radio, wondering if it even worked. He noticed and let out a short laugh. "You think I'm not real security, huh?" he said. He stepped closer, and I stepped back. My heart was pounding now. "Where are we really going?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a keyring. I didn't wait to find out what he was unlocking. I turned and bolted back down the hallway. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing. I didn't look back. My legs were moving faster than they ever had, my breath coming in short gasps. The hallway felt endless, but I could see the faint glow of the exit sign in the distance. The sound of his boots pounding against the floor got louder. He was chasing me. I reached the door I tried earlier, the one that had been locked. I slammed into it, pushing with all my weight. It still didn't move. Come on," I whispered, frantically looking for a way out. His footsteps were almost on me. I turned just as he reached out, his hand grazing my arm. I ducked and slipped past him, running back the way I'd come. "Get back here," he yelled. I didn't stop. I turned a corner and saw a door with a small window. Light was streaming through it. The main lobby. I pushed through the door and stumbled into the lobby, where a group of people was gathered near the main exits. They all turned to look at me, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "Help!" I shouted. "He's chasing me." I pointed back toward the hallway, but when I turned, the man was gone. A few ushers came over, asking me what happened. I tried to explain, but I could barely catch my breath. They called the police, and I waited with them until officers arrived. They searched the building but didn't find anyone matching the description I gave. The emergency exit door had been locked from the outside, and no one could explain why. I never went back to that theater again. It started about a month after I moved into the duplex. I wasn't paying much attention at first because I was juggling work and my son, Ethan. He's 6, and it's just the two of us since his dad and I split. We'd moved into the place because the rent was manageable, and it was close to his school and my job. The first thing I noticed was the back door. I always locked it before leaving for work, always. One morning, I came back from dropping Ethan off and found it unlocked. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Life's busy, right? But it kept happening. One day, I found a sticky note on the fridge. It was a generic yellow square, but it wasn't mine. It just said, "Nice place." I didn't know what to make of it. Ethan didn't know how to write well enough to leave it, and he hadn't even been home that day. I threw it away, thinking it was a prank or maybe something that had somehow stuck from a store or something weird. I didn't want to overthink it. Then other things started showing up. A pen on the table I didn't recognize, a mug on the counter I was sure I hadn't put there. I started asking Ethan if he'd been playing with anything, but he just looked confused and said no. A week later, I found a note folded into my work bag. It just said, "You're doing great." I should have felt comforted, I guess, but my stomach dropped. Who writes something like that and leaves it where I definitely see it? I thought maybe a coworker had slipped it in, but I didn't bring that bag inside work. It stayed in the car. I started double-checking all the locks. The front door, back door, the windows. I'd even prop a chair against the door at night. But it didn't help. I'd come home and find little things moved, cushions off the couch, shoes lined up differently. The worst was the laundry. I don't have a dryer, so I hang things up in the small laundry room by the kitchen. One afternoon, I found Ethan's school uniform folded perfectly on the counter. I hadn't folded it. I started looking at the neighbors differently. Most of them kept to themselves, but the guy in the other half of the duplex stood out. His name was Mike, and he'd introduced himself when I moved in. He seemed nice, but he was nosy. He always made comments about when I left or came back. "Early start today, huh? Or you're home late." At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but now I wondered if he was paying too much attention. One night, I heard creaking downstairs. Ethan was asleep, and I was in bed, but the sound made me sit straight up. It was subtle, like someone trying to move quietly. I grabbed my phone and texted Mike. He replied immediately, saying he was out of town. That's when I really started panicking. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in my room with a kitchen knife, listening to every sound until the sun came up. The next day, I called a locksmith. He changed the locks on both doors, and I felt a little better. For about a week, everything seemed normal. Then I found another note. It was tucked into Ethan's favorite book on the shelf in the living room. It said, "Cute kid." I took Ethan to my mom's that night. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what was going on. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. There was no sign of forced entry, no real evidence of a crime. "Just keep an eye out," they said. I decided to set up cameras. Cheap ones I bought online, but they worked. I placed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one at the back door. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mike. The first few nights, nothing happened. Then, on the third night, I saw him. Mike. He used a key. He walked into my house like it was his. He didn't even look around, just went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a soda. Then he sat on my couch and watched TV. My TV. I didn't even know what to do. I felt sick watching it. He got up after about half an hour, went into the laundry room, and just stood there, looking at the clothes on the rack. Then he left. I called the police again and showed them the footage. They took it seriously this time. They came out and arrested him. Turned out he'd made a copy of the key before I moved in. He'd lived in my half of the duplex before me and still had access. They found other keys at his place, and notes he'd written, detailed ones about me and Ethan, our schedules, what we ate, what time I went to bed. It's been months, and I still can't sleep well. I moved out a week after it happened. Ethan doesn't know the full story, and I don't plan on telling him. I just want to forget it, but I don't think I ever will. Knowing someone was in my space, watching us, touching our things. It's something I can't shake. I went camping alone because I thought I needed some quiet. The last few months had been stressful, and getting out into the woods felt like the only way to clear my head. I picked a spot at a state park I'd visited before, but this time I decided to venture deeper, away from the other campers. I didn't want to hear anyone else talking or their radios or whatever. Just nature. The first day was fine. I set up my tent by a small clearing near a creek. It was peaceful, just the sound of water and birds. By sunset, I was already feeling better. I cooked a small dinner on my little portable stove, cleaned up, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. The sounds outside were calming, and it didn't take long to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the noise. But then I heard it again. Something was moving outside the tent. It wasn't a small animal like a squirrel or raccoon. It was heavier. I could hear deliberate footsteps on the ground. Slow, deliberate. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a deer. They wander through campsites all the time, right? But then I heard the zipper of my backpack. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone was going through my stuff. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. I had forgotten to plug it into the power bank before falling asleep. My flashlight was near my feet, and I managed to grab it without making too much noise. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I didn't dare turn the flashlight on. Instead, I just listened. Whoever it was, they were still there. I could hear them rummaging around. The clinking of pots and the rustling of plastic bags. My food bag. They were going through my food. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I hadn't thought this through. What was I supposed to do if it wasn't an animal? What if it was a person? The rummaging stopped, and for a few seconds, it was completely silent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Then, there was a light tapping on the side of the tent. It was soft, almost playful, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe if I didn't react, they'd get bored and leave. The tapping stopped, and I thought for a second they were gone. Then I heard the zipper of the tent. Not the bag. The tent. They were unzipping the tent. I panicked and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the zipper. I yelled, "Who's there? Get out of here." My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The light must have startled them because they stopped. But they didn't run. Instead, I saw a shadow outside. They were just standing there, their outline visible through the thin fabric. They didn't say anything, didn't move. Just stood there. I grabbed the only thing I had nearby that could be used as a weapon, a small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. I held it tight, my hands shaking. I'm armed. I yelled. I'll use it if I have to. The shadow moved then, but not away. They crouched down, their head now level with the tent. I could feel them watching me through the fabric. Then they said, "You shouldn't have come out here alone." Their voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't work. The shadow stood up again and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. I waited, clutching the hatchet, for what felt like hours. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. When the first light of dawn came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. My backpack was empty, its contents scattered everywhere. My food was gone, along with my wallet. The firewood I'd stacked up was kicked over, and there were footprints all around my campsite. I didn't waste any time packing up. I stuffed everything into the backpack, even though it was a mess, and left. I didn't bother following the trail back. I just headed in the direction I thought would lead me to the park entrance. It took hours, and I was exhausted by the time I made it back to the main road. When I got to the ranger station, I told them what happened. They didn't seem surprised. One of the rangers told me there had been reports of strange activity in the area lately, campsites being messed with, food stolen. They didn't have any suspects but said they'd keep an eye out. I haven't been camping since. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that shadow outside my tent and those words, "You shouldn't have come out here alone." I remember the day clearly because it started so ordinary. I was working from home, sitting at my desk in the living room with my laptop open. Around mid-morning, the internet went out. I tried resetting the modem a couple of times, but nothing worked. It was frustrating since I had a meeting in less than an hour. Before I could call the service provider, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was a man standing there in a uniform shirt with the company logo stitched on. He had a tool belt around his waist and a clipboard in his hand. "Hi, I'm with the internet service. We got reports of outages in the area," he said. His voice was calm, friendly even. I hadn't called them yet, but I figured someone else must have. I asked if he needed to check anything, and he nodded. "Yeah, I'll need to look at your modem and wiring," he said, glancing past me into the house. I let him in, thinking nothing of it. He followed me to the living room where the modem was. As he worked, he asked questions. At first, they were normal, like how long the internet had been out or if I'd noticed any other issues. Then they started to get personal. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, crouching by the modem. I hesitated but told him no, my husband would be back soon. That wasn't true, my husband was out of town for the week, but something about the question made me uncomfortable. "Oh, good," he said, smiling up at me. "It's nice to have someone around. Makes the place feel less lonely." He finished looking at the modem and stood up. "I'll need to check outside, near the wiring box. Can you show me where that is?" I led him to the back door, pointing out the box on the side of the house. He nodded but didn't go outside right away. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, looking around the kitchen and then back at me. "This is a nice house," he said. "How long have you lived here?" "About 5 years," I said, keeping my answer short now. He stepped closer to the counter, looking at the photos I had pinned on the fridge. "You've got a nice family," he said, pointing at a picture of me, my husband, and our dog. I didn't respond, just stood there, hoping he'd go outside already. After a few more seconds, he finally stepped out the back door. I closed it behind him and locked it. I went back to the living room, watching through the window as he pretended to inspect the wiring box. He wasn't doing much, just walking around, looking at his clipboard, and glancing back at the house. That's when I noticed his van parked on the street. It was plain white, no company logo on the side. My stomach sank. I grabbed my phone and searched for the number for the internet company. When I called, the representative said there hadn't been any technicians dispatched to my area that day. My heart was pounding as I hung up. I went to the front door and peeked through the peephole. The van was still there, and he hadn't come back inside yet, but I knew I needed to act fast. I locked all the doors and windows and ran to the bedroom, grabbing my husband's old baseball bat from the closet. Then I called 911. The operator kept me on the line while I waited for the police. She told me to stay quiet and keep the doors locked. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own breathing. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the back porch. He was back, knocking on the door. "Ma'am," he called out. "I need to check something inside again." I didn't answer. The knocking got louder. "Ma'am, are you there?" "I just need a few more minutes." I stayed hidden in the bedroom, clutching the bat so tightly my hands hurt. The knocking stopped, and everything went quiet. I thought maybe he'd left, but then I heard a noise at one of the windows. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm. She said officers were on their way. I heard the sound of glass breaking. He was trying to get in. I stayed where I was, shaking and gripping the bat, until I finally heard sirens outside. The police arrived just in time. They found him trying to climb through the broken window. It turned out he wasn't with the internet company at all. He'd stolen the uniform, shirt, and equipment. He had a criminal record, too, for burglary and assault. The police said I did the right thing by not letting him back in and calling 911. They didn't think he was here to fix anything. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how easily I let him into my home. It's terrifying to think about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. It started on a Friday night. I just finished dinner at a small cafe downtown and was walking back to my car when someone brushed past me hard enough to knock my purse from my shoulder. I didn't think much of it at first, just someone in a hurry. But when I bent down to grab it, it wasn't there. The person who'd bumped me was already disappearing around the corner, and I realized they had it. My heart sank. My whole life was in that bag: wallet, keys, phone. I ran after them, but by the time I turned the corner, they were gone. I flagged down a nearby police officer and explained what had happened. He said they'd file a report but didn't sound optimistic about giving it back. I drove home feeling shaken. I canceled my credit cards, locked my phone remotely, and changed some passwords from my laptop. I thought that was the end of it. Annoying, yes, but manageable. I didn't even bother to tell my family. It wasn't worth the stress. The next morning, my mom called. Her voice was tight, like she'd been crying. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, and she sounded surprised. She said she'd gotten a text from me the night before saying I was in trouble and needed money. My stomach turned over. I hadn't sent anything like that. I checked my accounts immediately. Someone had managed to get into my email. There were drafts of messages I hadn't written and emails forwarded to addresses I didn't recognize. They'd sent messages to my friends and family asking for help, claiming I'd been in an accident and needed cash urgently. Some of them had even responded. I called the bank and froze everything, but it wasn't fast enough. A few transactions had already gone through online shopping, money transfers. I spent hours on the phone trying to clean up the mess. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I got a text from my sister. It was strange because she rarely messaged me so late. She asked if I was okay and said she was outside. Confused, I went to the window and looked out. Her car wasn't there. I texted her back, saying I was fine, and asked what she meant. She replied, "You just told me to come over. Said you needed me." I hadn't sent that. I checked my messages and found one I didn't remember typing, sent from my number to hers. My heart pounded as I stared at it. The wording didn't even sound like me. I stayed up the rest of the night, checking my locks over and over, convinced someone was watching me. I thought about calling the police, but what could they do? No one had broken in, and the texts didn't prove anything. The next morning, I went to the phone store to get my number changed. They told me my account had been accessed from another device, likely by someone who'd gotten into my carrier account using personal information from my wallet. They secured it, and I left with a new number. I hoped that would solve the problem. It didn't. By Monday, emails were coming in from places I hadn't been, confirmation of hotel reservations, online purchases, even a gym membership. Someone was pretending to be me. Worse, they were good at it. They'd use my social media to post updates, things like feeling sick, taking a break from the world, so anyone who noticed the weird messages wouldn't question them. I went to the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. They opened an investigation and advised me to monitor my accounts closely. They said it could be a case of identity theft, but something about it felt too personal for that. Whoever was doing this didn't just want my money, they wanted to take over my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It said, "You can't stop me." I froze. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to block the number, but I didn't. Instead, I replied, "Who's this?" The response came instantly, "You." I didn't sleep at all after that. I called the police in the morning and showed them the texts. They said they'd trace the number and see what they could find. They told me to keep my doors locked and not to go anywhere alone. That evening, I noticed my front door lock looked different. Scratched, like someone had tried to force it. I checked all the windows, and one of them was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I stayed at a friend's house that night. The next day, I got another text. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my house. My hands were in the sink, washing dishes. I hadn't even known anyone was there. The message said, "I'm always watching." That was the last straw. I went back to the police, and this time, they sent someone to my house. They found a camera hidden in my living room, a small, black device tucked between books on a shelf. I felt sick. I hadn't noticed it, hadn't even thought to look. The officers told me to pack a bag and stay somewhere else while they investigated. I left that afternoon and went to my parents' house. For the first time, I told them everything. The police eventually traced the texts to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station across town. The camera had no fingerprints, and the email trail led nowhere. Whoever it was, they'd been careful. Too careful. I haven't been back to my house since. I'm staying with my parents for now, trying to put my life back together. The texts have stopped, but I still feel like someone's watching me. I don't know if they'll ever find the person who did this, and I'm not sure I want to know who it was. We got home earlier than planned because the dinner at the restaurant wrapped up quicker than we thought. My wife and I were both in a good mood, laughing about some silly joke the waiter had made. As I unlocked the front door, the house was quiet, which struck me as odd. Normally, we'd hear the faint sound of cartoons or our son's little giggles from the living room. When we stepped inside, the babysitter, Claire, was standing in the middle of the hallway. She was facing us, her arms hanging stiff by her sides, but she didn't say anything right away. I said, "Hey, Claire, we're back. Everything okay?" She didn't answer, just stared at us with this blank look, like she was trying to figure something out. My wife nudged me, giving me a look like, "What's up with her?" Before I could say anything else, Claire moved toward the door behind us and locked it. Her movements were deliberate, not hurried, but very precise. The sound of the deadbolt clicking felt louder than it should have in the silence. I asked her, "Why'd you lock the door?" She turned back to face me, her eyes wide now, but not scared, more like alert. "I don't think it's safe to leave yet," she said, her voice low and steady. "Safe? What do you mean?" my wife asked, stepping closer to me. Claire glanced toward the staircase, then back to us. "I heard something upstairs," she said. "I didn't want to panic your son, so I stayed down here with him." That sent a chill through me. "You didn't check?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I thought it'd be better to wait for you to get back." I glanced at my wife. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open like she was about to say something but didn't know what. "Where's Jason?" I asked, referring to our son. "He's asleep in his room," Claire said quickly, almost too quickly. "I checked on him a few minutes ago. He's fine." I wanted to believe her, but something about her tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince us. I looked toward the stairs. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, the kind of darkness that feels heavier somehow when you're already on edge. My wife started to move toward the staircase, but Claire stepped in front of her. "I really don't think you should go up there right now," she said firmly, almost like she was scolding her. "What are you talking about?" my wife snapped. "That's my son up there." Claire didn't move. "I can't let you," she said, her voice quieter now but still firm. "Not until I'm sure it's safe." I was starting to get angry, but more than that, I was scared. I didn't understand what was happening, and the way Claire was acting didn't make any sense. She'd always been this sweet, calm girl who our son loved. This was completely out of character for her. "Move," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We're going upstairs." She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside. "Just be careful," she said. Her tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't exactly reassuring either. We went up the stairs together, my wife clutching my arm. The floor creaked under our feet, every sound magnified in the quiet. When we reached Jason's room, I pushed the door open slowly. He was there, curled up under his blanket, his chest rising and falling in the soft glow of his nightlight. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the room felt wrong. Heavy. I backed out of the room, closing the door as quietly as I could. My wife looked at me, her eyes questioning. I just shook my head, not wanting to speak out loud. As we turned to head back downstairs, we heard a faint sound, like a soft rustling, coming from the hallway closet. My wife grabbed my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. Claire's words echoed in my head. I heard something upstairs. I stepped toward the closet, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My wife whispered, "Don't," but I ignored her. I had to know. I reached out and grabbed the doorknob, my hand trembling. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open. The closet was empty, just coats and shoes. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and a little ridiculous. But then, as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. One of the coats was moving, ever so slightly, like it had been brushed by something or someone. I yanked the coat aside, and there, crouched in the shadows, was a man. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained, his eyes wide and wild. Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking me back into the hallway. My wife screamed, and Jason started crying in his room. The man didn't say anything, just scrambled to his feet and bolted down the stairs. We chased after him, but by the time we got to the living room, the front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Claire was gone too. We called the police, of course. They came, searched the house, and took our statements. They said Claire was probably just scared and ran when the man did, but that didn't sit right with me. The way she acted, the way she tried to keep us from going upstairs, it felt like she knew he was there. Like she was trying to protect him or keep us from finding out. We never saw her again. She didn't show up for her next scheduled babysitting job, and when we tried to contact her, her phone was disconnected. The police said they'd look into it, but as far as I know, they never found her. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was more to it than we'll ever know. I've been running the same route for years. It's early mornings, just after sunrise, when the streets are still empty and the air is cool. I like the peace of it, the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, my breathing in time with the steady beat of my heart. There's something soothing about being alone with my thoughts. But that morning, everything changed. I was on my usual route, heading down a quieter stretch of the park, when I saw him. He was standing by the sidewalk, looking down at something in his hands. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People are always walking or sitting, especially around the park. As I got closer, he lifted his head and looked right at me. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice a little too loud for the stillness of the morning. I slowed my pace just slightly, not wanting to come off rude, but I wasn't in the mood to stop. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my pace up. I wasn't planning on engaging much. "Do you know where the nearest gas station is?" he asked, still standing in the same spot. His hands were shaking slightly, like maybe he was cold or nervous. His clothes were ragged, nothing that screamed normal. Just a plain hoodie and worn-out jeans, nothing remarkable. "Ah, yeah. Just keep going down the street and turn left at the next light," I said, not wanting to be bothered. I started to pick up speed again, hoping that would end the conversation. But he didn't move. "Actually," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm kind of lost. Do you know if there's a bus stop around here?" At this point, I was slowing down, not sure how to handle it. He wasn't exactly threatening, but something about his demeanor felt off. He was too still, too intense. And the fact that he hadn't moved from his spot told me something wasn't right. "There's a bus stop about a block away," I said, not breaking stride, trying to give a quick answer and move along. But he wasn't letting up. Can you help me find it?" I stopped. Not fully, but enough that I could look at him. There was something in his eyes, something desperate, almost pleading. The sun was starting to rise higher, casting a warm light on everything around, but I felt a chill run through me. He was standing too close, now taking a step toward me. "I don't know if I can." "I'm just running," I said, my voice tight. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck in a situation where I felt unsafe. He didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he didn't care. "I just need help," he said, his voice quieter now, more insistent. "I'm really lost. It's really important." There was a pause. He seemed to be waiting for something. I felt my chest tighten. My instincts told me to go, to move, to get away, but I stayed. I wanted to be polite. I wanted to help, but something in me screamed to walk away. Still, I wasn't sure what to do. I stood there for a second, trying to find the right words, but the moment felt strange, heavy. He was looking at me like he was waiting for me to do something. I really need to find it. You're not going anywhere, right? He asked. What? My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly felt very exposed. He had no business asking me that. No business asking me anything anymore. I took a quick step back. I've got to go, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I turned and began jogging again, but before I could even get a few paces away, I heard his footsteps behind me. Heavy and deliberate. Not the quick, light footfalls of someone who's just out for a morning jog like me. I could feel his presence closing in behind me. I picked up the pace, trying to put distance between us, but he matched it. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it now, he was following me. I looked over my shoulder. He was maybe 10 feet away, and he wasn't slowing down. His pace was steady, determined. And now I was scared. Why are you following me? I asked, my voice coming out shaky even though I didn't want it to. He didn't answer. He just kept following, keeping that distance, like he was toying with me. I rounded a corner, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced back again, he was still there, just behind me. His gaze never left me. A sudden panic flooded me. I knew I couldn't outrun him for long, and I didn't want to go any further into the park. It was too isolated, too empty. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even have my phone with me. There was a bridge ahead, a small overpass that led to a busier street. I made up my mind and began running hard, faster than I'd ever run before, trying to reach that bridge. The sound of his footsteps grew louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I made it to the bridge, and for the first time, I risked a glance behind me. He was still there, maybe 20 feet back. But something had changed. The look in his eyes was more urgent now, like he realized he'd almost lost me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I ran as fast as I could toward the main road where there were cars, people, life. I couldn't risk staying in that park, not with him so close. I made it to the main street and kept going until I reached a convenience store. The door was unlocked, and I rushed inside, breathless, shaking. I looked out the window, but he didn't follow me any further. He had stopped just at the entrance to the park, watching me. And then he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stayed inside for a while, unsure of what to do. I didn't call the police because I couldn't explain it. Nothing had really happened, right? He hadn't hurt me. He just followed me, made me feel like prey. But it was enough to make my heart race even now, days later. I don't know what his intentions were, but I know one thing: I've never run that route again. It was just another late night at the office. I had so much work to finish and thought it would be easier to just stay in the empty building instead of trying to get it all done the next day. The quiet was kind of nice, actually. I could focus without the usual distractions. Everyone else had already gone home, so I thought I'd have the place to myself for a few hours. I don't usually stay late. But the pressure from my boss had been intense, and this project had a tight deadline. I was an intern, so I had to prove myself. The dim lighting of the office made it easier to concentrate, the soft hum of the computers and the occasional sound of paper shuffling keeping me company. At least, that's what I thought. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The security lights in the hallway flickered. They never did that before. I thought it was just the wiring or some minor issue with the lights. I went back to my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, like a presence that wasn't supposed to be there. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, I was alone. Then, I heard it. A faint noise. A rustling. I froze, straining to listen. It was coming from the hallway. My heart raced, and I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the cleaning crew was still around. But no, it was much too late for that. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, trying to peek into the hallway. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, there was no sign of anyone. I figured it was just a power surge, nothing to worry about. But then I heard footsteps. Soft, slow steps. They echoed down the hallway, just faint enough that I wasn't sure if I was hearing things. I quickly looked over at the hallway exit, hoping someone would walk past. But nobody did. The footsteps kept coming closer, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone's breathing. My stomach dropped. This was wrong. I slowly backed away from the door, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed my phone, ready to call security if I had to, but before I could press the number, the door creaked open. I didn't know who it was at first. They stepped into the light just enough for me to see the outline of a person, but their face was hidden in shadow. I froze, hoping they would just go away, but they didn't. "Hey," a voice called out, rough and tired. "It's me." I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it was familiar. It took me a moment before the person stepped closer, and I could see their face. It was Matt. Matt was one of the senior employees in the marketing department, but he'd been fired weeks ago. He had left the company under strange circumstances, and I'd heard rumors about it. He'd been a bit odd, but nobody ever really talked about what had happened. He just stopped showing up one day. Matt was standing in front of me now, wearing an old company t-shirt, his hair disheveled. His eyes were wide, as if he hadn't slept in days. I could see that he was sweaty, his clothes wrinkled. But there was something off about him, something wasn't right. I backed away, unsure of what to say. "Matt, what are you doing here?" My voice was shaky. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes darting around the office. "I've been here for a while. Been working, you know," he said, his voice flat. "I just didn't want to leave." I felt my chest tighten. "Matt, you can't be here. You don't work here anymore. The building is closed. You need to go." He didn't seem to hear me. He just stood there, staring at me like I wasn't even speaking. Then, he started walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't need to leave," he said, his voice taking on more menacing edge. "I like it here. I like the quiet. I don't want anyone to find out, but they'll understand. They'll all understand." My blood ran cold. Something was terribly wrong. I had to leave. I turned toward the exit, but before I could make it, he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You shouldn't go anywhere," he said, his voice low. "It's safer here. I don't want to be alone anymore." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified. This wasn't Matt anymore. Whoever this was, it wasn't the same person I had known. His demeanor had shifted, and I could feel it. The air around me seemed heavier now. "Matt, please," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "You need help. I'm calling security. I'm calling someone." I reached for my phone again, but before I could dial, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. I yelped and tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. I don't want anyone else here. I don't want to go back. The look in his eyes was something I couldn't explain, wild, desperate. There was no rationality there, just a kind of crazed desperation. My mind raced, and I thought of every possible way to get away, but I knew I had to act fast. I had to get out of there, and I had to get away from him. I twisted my arm free, shoving him back as hard as I could. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. I ran for the nearest exit, my feet pounding against the floor. I didn't stop until I was outside the building, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I just ran. I stayed in the parking lot, trembling, until the security guard came to check on me. I don't know what Matt's intentions were, but I never went back to that office building after that night. I found a new internship elsewhere, and I didn't even tell anyone about what happened. I couldn't. Every time I drive past that building, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. What if I hadn't left when I did? What was he really planning? All I know is that I'm glad I'm not there anymore. And I pray I never have to face Matt again. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't stop thinking about it. It started off as an ordinary drive, just me on a quiet road, the kind that goes on forever with hardly any traffic. I'd been out for a few hours, taking the back roads through the countryside. My goal was just to clear my head, enjoy some solitude. The sun had started to set, casting everything in a dim golden light, and the road was empty. It was peaceful. But then I saw him. He was standing at the side of the road, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a person in trouble. Maybe their car had broken down or they needed directions. I was alone, and it was the kind of road where help could be a long time coming, so I thought I'd stop and see if he was okay. It wasn't until I was closer that I started to get a bad feeling. There was something off about the way he was standing, how rigid he seemed, like he was almost too still for someone who was supposedly in need. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to at least be cautious. As I got closer, the man didn't step forward, just stood there with his arms out, still waving, his face impossible to read. I could see his eyes now. Something about them, it wasn't panic or desperation, but more like calculation. The pit of my stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't a kid anymore, and it was probably fine. I stopped a few feet from him, rolled down the window, and asked, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and finally nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice a little rough. "I've been walking for miles. My truck broke down back there. I don't know what happened to it. Can you give me a lift to the gas station, just a few miles up the road?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I could see that his clothes were dirty, but there wasn't any sign of a breakdown, no car nearby, no tools. Just this guy, standing on the side of the road, looking like he'd been out there for hours. I wanted to drive off, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Are you sure it's not far?" I asked, my eyes scanning the trees along the road behind him. "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just up there. It's not far, I swear." I hesitated for a second longer, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From behind the trees, figures started to emerge. At first, I thought maybe they were other travelers, but then I saw the way they moved, purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't the casual walk of someone on a hike. It was controlled. That's when everything hit me. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't just random people. I don't know how I knew, but I could tell. I quickly rolled the window up halfway, keeping my hand on the door handle, just in case. The first figure that came out was a man, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Behind him, two more people, a woman and another man. They all looked off. Their clothes were mismatched, like they had been wearing whatever they could find. They weren't acting normal either. Their eyes were fixed on me, and they were moving with intent. The man who'd been standing by the road had stopped waving and was just staring at me now, a strange half-smile forming on his lips. I could feel my heart racing as my mind went into overdrive, calculating escape routes. I glanced behind me, trying to figure out if I could make a fast getaway. The road stretched out for miles, and I had no idea what was out there. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The man who'd been flagging me down took a step closer, his hand resting on the side of my car. "You know," he said, his tone changing, becoming smoother, more menacing, "we don't take kindly to people who don't help each other out around here." My throat tightened. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. But just as I was about to shift into drive, the man placed his hand on my side mirror and leaned down. "It'd be better if you just got out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No reason to make this hard." The others had closed the distance now. The woman was smiling, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The two men were standing off to the side, each of them looking ready to move at any moment. I froze, not knowing what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel before I sped off, throwing up a cloud of dust in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back once, seeing them all standing there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. It was only when I rounded a corner and they disappeared from view that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to my life itself. I didn't see them again, but I kept checking my mirrors the entire way, convinced they were somehow following me. I made it to the next town and found a small diner to stop at, where I called the police and explained everything. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but they said they'd look into it. They told me to be cautious, but the road was too quiet and remote for them to have much information. I don't know who they were, but I'm glad I drove away. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I haven't gone back on that road since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about those people, I just knew they weren't out there for a friendly chat. And I still wonder if I was the only one they'd ever tried it with. It started with a package. I came home one evening, after a long day at work, and noticed it on my doorstep. It wasn't anything I was expecting, no delivery notices or anything. Just this small, nondescript box. The sort of thing you think nothing of, except for one thing, it had no return address. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was one of those mystery boxes people sometimes order for fun, or maybe someone had sent me something by mistake. But when I picked it up, it felt heavier than I expected. I stood there for a minute, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out if I should open it or not. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't explain why. I decided to open it. There was no note, just a stack of photographs inside. I froze when I saw the first one. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street. Not just any photo, though. This was taken from the angle of my front porch, the same angle I'd see if I were standing at the edge of my lawn. But I didn't recognize the camera or the hand holding it. There was no way I had taken this picture, but it was definitely my house. The photo was crisp, clear, almost unnervingly so. I felt a chill run down my spine as I flipped through the rest of the photos. Each one was taken from a different spot, but all from the same general area outside my house. One of them showed me standing in my kitchen, my back turned to the window, unaware of whoever was outside. Another showed me sitting at my desk in my office, again, not knowing I was being watched. The photos were not of anything that should have been publicly visible, things I thought were private moments. I looked through all of them, trying to make sense of who could have taken them and why. The photos weren't necessarily clear about what time they were taken, but I knew. I knew every single one of them had been taken when I was completely alone. And no one had been in my house, or so I thought. The moment I finished flipping through the pictures, I heard a sound. A knock at my door. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor, or someone trying to sell something. But then it came again, more persistent this time. Knock. 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 I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't move at first. My heart was pounding in my chest. The photos had made me feel like someone was watching me. And now, someone was knocking at my door after sending me these images. My mind raced, but I couldn't figure out what to do. Another knock. This one was louder. Then a voice called out from the other side, low and calm but unmistakable. I know you're in there. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My whole body felt frozen. My legs wouldn't move, and my hands were trembling so much I nearly dropped the box with the photos. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself in a room, but I couldn't make myself move. I heard the voice again. You're not going to call the police, are you? They won't help you. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. I swallowed hard. What did that even mean? How did they know I had those photos? How could they have known I would be home at that time? The knocking continued, growing faster now, more insistent. I know you're there. Open the door. You don't want me to come inside. I felt my legs finally give way, and I sank down to the floor. My hands were shaking violently now, and I held the photos tightly, as if somehow they would protect me or give me answers. I pressed my back to the wall and tried to think. My mind was clouded with fear, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out. Get away from whoever was on the other side of that door. But I couldn't just leave the house. I couldn't abandon everything I had here. I couldn't just go out the back and run blindly into the night. Then, after what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. I didn't move. Not for a long time. I stayed as still as I possibly could, listening for any sounds. I tried to peek through the curtains without letting them see me, but everything was so quiet, too quiet. I knew the person, whoever they were, was still out there. I had to do something. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed to get to the phone. I needed to call the police. But what if they were watching? What if they were listening? I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally forcing myself to stand. I grabbed my phone, my heart still hammering, and slowly, quietly, I moved to the back of the house, staying out of sight. I called 911 as I opened the back door, stepped into the yard, and quietly closed it behind me. I ran, making sure to stay low, until I reached the neighbor's house. I didn't stop. I rang the doorbell, hoping they'd let me in. The neighbor wasn't home, but their car was in the driveway, so I kept trying. I could hear the sirens in the distance, but it felt like they would never reach me in time. It felt like an eternity before I saw the police lights flashing in the distance, but I wasn't about to wait any longer. The cops arrived shortly after. They didn't find anyone, of course. No one had been on my porch. No one had been near my door. But I was still terrified. When they asked about the photos, I showed them the box. They didn't know what to make of it. They told me to file a report, but they weren't optimistic. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. It was hard to forget those images. Hard to forget that feeling of being watched. I don't know who it was. I still don't. But I haven't seen that package again, and I haven't gotten any more strange knocks. But I'm still waiting, and I'm still scared. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that they're still watching. Still out there. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to getting home. The train schedule was messed up again, so I decided to get a rideshare instead. I pulled up my app, entered my destination, and ordered the ride. I was tired and didn't think much about it. The car showed up fairly quickly, and I got in. The driver didn't say much when I hopped in, just nodded and started driving. I sat back and opened my phone to catch up on some messages. The car seemed to be moving in the right direction at first. But after a few turns, I started to feel like we weren't heading toward my neighborhood anymore. I looked up. The streetlights were becoming sparse, and the roads were getting quieter. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself maybe there was just some traffic or a detour. But after a few more minutes, I couldn't ignore it. We were definitely getting farther from where I needed to go. I sat up and asked, "Hey, are you sure you're going the right way?" I tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my voice. The driver didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the road, hands firmly gripping the wheel. The streetlights were now almost non-existent, and I could barely see anything outside the window. It felt like we were driving through some industrial area. "Hey," I said again, this time a little louder. "Where are we going?" "You're not going the right way." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't speak. That's when I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. I pressed the button to unlock the door, planning to get out. But when I reached for the handle, I realized the child lock was on. I tried to stay calm, but the car was now on a deserted road, with only a few faint lights off in the distance. I was pretty sure we were nowhere near my place. I started to feel panic creeping in. "Pull over. I don't want to go any farther. Stop the car right now." The driver didn't answer. He just kept driving, his expression never changing. It was like he didn't hear me at all. I was starting to feel trapped. I looked at my phone. The app showed we were getting farther from my destination, but there wasn't much signal. The screen kept freezing, and the map was taking forever to load. I tried to call the ride service, but the call wouldn't go through. "Can you just stop?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm serious. I don't feel comfortable. Pull over now." Still nothing. I glanced over at the driver. He was wearing some kind of uniform, but I didn't recognize it. His face was expressionless. I couldn't tell if he was trying to look calm or if he was just blank. I started feeling that gut-wrenching sense of something being terribly wrong. I quickly scanned the area outside the window again. There were no cars around. No signs of life. I wasn't even sure which direction we were going at this point. I reached for my phone again and tried to message someone, but it was useless. The signal was completely gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed hard on the door handle, but it didn't budge. I tried to pull the handle again, even harder, but it was useless. The door was locked. My heart started racing. My head was spinning. I felt trapped, and every time I looked at the driver, he wouldn't even acknowledge me. It was like I wasn't even there. I took a deep breath and told myself not to panic. I had to figure this out. I looked around the car, trying to think of something, anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. There was nothing. No signs, no help, no way out. I turned to the driver again. "Stop the car," I said, my voice trembling now. "Please, stop the car." The driver didn't even glance at me this time. He just kept his eyes forward, his expression cold. I had to do something, or I was never going to get out of here. In a split second, I made up my mind. I reached for the door handle again, but this time, I did something different. I grabbed the sleeve of my jacket and used it to protect my hand. I yanked the handle with everything I had. This time, it gave. The door popped open. Before the car could slow down, I didn't think twice. I just shoved myself out of the seat and pushed myself out of the moving car. My legs hit the ground hard, and I stumbled but kept moving. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The car didn't stop. I could hear it speeding off into the distance, and I didn't look back. I don't remember how long I ran for, but I finally made it to a lit street. There were a few houses nearby. I knocked on the first door I saw, and luckily, the person inside was kind enough to let me use their phone. I called for another ride, explained what had happened, and waited for help. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been able to get out of that car. I still don't know who the driver was or what his intentions were. I don't want to think about it. But I'll never forget the way he ignored me, the way he didn't even acknowledge my presence. It felt like I was invisible to him, and that's what scared me the most. I still take ride shares, but I'm a lot more careful now. I never take anything for granted. And I always check that my door is unlocked. Always. It was supposed to be a relaxing solo getaway. I had booked a room at this small hotel in the mountains, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I wanted some quiet time to read, reflect, maybe take a hike or two. The place was a bit old, but it had good reviews and seemed like the perfect spot for a peaceful retreat. When I checked in, the receptionist, a young woman with pale skin and dark circles under her eyes, greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was polite but didn't say much beyond the essentials, like where my room was and what time breakfast was served. It wasn't anything strange, just a bit of a weird vibe. I brushed it off. It was late, and I was tired. I went up to my room, unpacked a little, and decided to take a shower. The water pressure was strong, which was nice. When I stepped out, wrapped in a towel, I glanced out the window. The view was beautiful, mountains stretching out far and wide. It was everything I had hoped for. I got dressed, made myself some tea, and settled in with a book. I wasn't expecting much excitement, but around 9 p.m., I heard a knock on the door. A soft knock, almost tentative. I figured it was probably just housekeeping, but when I opened it, there was no one in the hallway. I stepped out and looked both ways. Nothing. I shrugged, thinking maybe I had imagined it. I went back inside and locked the door. It wasn't long before I heard another knock, this time louder, more deliberate. I opened the door again, and this time, there was a man standing there. He wore a staff uniform, though it was slightly different from the usual hotel attire. His name tag read Eric. "I'm just checking in to make sure everything is all right," he said, his tone calm but distant. I was confused. "Everything is fine, thank you. Is there a problem?" He shook his head, but the way he didn't move, just stood there, made me feel uneasy. "Just making sure you're okay. It's part of our policy to check in with guests late at night, for your safety." I didn't think much of it, though it seemed a bit odd. "All right, well, I'm fine. Thanks." I started to close the door. He didn't move. "I'll be checking back later," he said before walking away. I frowned, watching him disappear around the corner of the hallway. That had been strange, but I figured he was just doing his job, even if the timing was off. I locked the door and went back to my book, though I kept glancing at the clock. It was getting late. An hour passed, and the next thing I knew, there was another knock. My heart rate picked up a little. It was Eric again. I opened the door a crack. "I'm just making sure you're all right," he said, his face slightly closer than before. I could feel his breath. "I'm fine, thank you," I said, closing the door a bit faster this time. This time, I made sure to lock the deadbolt before sitting on the edge of the bed. I felt uneasy, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe this was just an overzealous employee, or some weird hotel policy. Whatever it was, I wasn't sure, but it was creeping me out. It wasn't long before there was another knock, this time more insistent. I jumped up, heart racing, and opened the door again. Eric was standing there again. This time, he didn't smile, and his eyes seemed almost empty. "I need to check on you again," he said, his voice softer, almost a whisper. "No," I said, standing firm, feeling a surge of fear. "I'm fine." "You've already checked. Please leave me alone." He didn't move. "I'm just making sure you're safe." I stepped back. "I'm safe. I don't need you to check on me again." For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. His expression was unreadable. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it again. This time, I felt a rush of panic. I called the front desk, my hands trembling. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's someone here, one of your employees. He keeps knocking on my door late at night, saying he's checking on me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, the receptionist spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but no one is scheduled to check on guests tonight." That sent a chill down my spine. "He's in a uniform," I said, my voice shaking. "His name is Eric. He's been knocking on my door for hours." Another pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll send someone up right away to check on it." I didn't feel reassured. In fact, I felt even more anxious. Why had they said no one was scheduled for that, if I had seen Eric with my own eyes? I waited, eyes fixed on the door. I tried to calm myself, but the moments stretched on. Minutes turned to half an hour. There was no knock. No staff member came to my door. Eventually, I grew brave enough to venture out into the hallway. It was quiet. Too quiet. I moved cautiously toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. As I passed the reception area, I noticed the receptionist was nowhere to be found. The lobby was empty. I ran to the back exit, my heart pounding. My car was parked outside. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. As I reached the exit, I glanced back up at the window to my room. The curtains were drawn open. And there, standing right behind the glass, was Eric, his face pressed up against the window. I rushed to my car, hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't care if the hotel was just a few miles out of the city. I wasn't going to stay there for another minute. I drove for what felt like hours, only stopping when I reached a well-lit, crowded highway. I never went back to that hotel. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed, but I'm pretty sure Eric wasn't really there to check on me. I never thought much about picking up hitchhikers, but it was late, and the rain had started coming down hard. I was driving back from a business trip, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The roads were quiet, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me because of the rain. Then, on the side of the road, I saw him just standing there, drenched, thumb out, staring into the headlights. I debated for a second. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but something made me pull over. Maybe it was the way he looked. He seemed harmless, just a guy in his mid-30s, with a rain-soaked jacket and a tired face. I rolled down the window a bit. "You need a ride?" I asked. He nodded quickly, stepping toward the car. "Yeah, please. I've been waiting for a while." I unlocked the door, and he slid in. He thanked me as he shut the door, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just past Clearwater," he said, looking out the window. "I'll get off soon. Just need to get out of the rain." "Clearwater?" "That's a couple hours away," I said, but I didn't mind. It was getting late, and I'd rather have some company on the road than not. We were the only two cars on the highway, and the rain wasn't showing any sign of stopping. "Yeah," he said, looking back at me. "I've got a friend out there. He's expecting me." His voice was calm, maybe a bit too calm for someone who had just been standing out in the pouring rain for who knows how long. I nodded and kept driving. For the next 20 minutes, there was silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something strange about him. He didn't seem to mind the quiet, and every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, like he was studying me. "You from around here?" he asked after a while. "No, just passing through," I replied. "Work trip?" He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the window. "Yeah, me too. Just passing through. Gotta get somewhere important." I didn't know why, but something about that made me uneasy. It was like the way he said it, like he was hiding something. I kept my focus on the road, trying not to let my mind wander. After about another 10 minutes, I heard him shift in his seat. I glanced over and saw him looking at me, but his expression was different now. Harder. It wasn't that friendly face anymore. His eyes were cold. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you didn't really have to stop, you know. You didn't have to pick me up." I felt a little chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. "You looked like you needed help," I said, glancing at him for a second before focusing back on the road. "I don't need anyone's help," he said, and now there was a sharpness to his voice. It wasn't the same person who had gotten into the car a while ago. "I just needed a ride, and now I'm stuck with you." I didn't know what to say. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just a little too tired or maybe he'd had a rough day. "It's all right," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Just trying to be friendly. He didn't respond. The air in the car had shifted. It wasn't the rain anymore, but something about the way he was sitting in his seat, his eyes locked on me, made the car feel smaller. He was still staring at me, unblinking. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You should probably get out when we hit the next exit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move. Didn't say a word for a long time. I glanced at him, just as the headlights cut through the rain. "Hey," I said. Before I could finish, he suddenly reached forward, grabbing the door handle like he was about to throw it open. I swerved to the side, almost hitting the guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to regain control of the car. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice shaking now. He let go of the handle, but he was still staring at me, his face twisted into something I couldn't quite read. "You think I'm just gonna let you tell me what to do? You think I'm just gonna get out when you say so?" The rain was pounding harder now, and the headlights barely cut through it. I tried to focus on the road, my hands slipping on the wheel. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said, my voice shaky. "You're not as nice as you think," he muttered. "You pick me up, so you deal with me now." I was starting to panic, but I tried not to show it. I didn't want to make him angrier. "I'll pull over at the next exit," I said. "You can get out there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his seat and chuckled. It wasn't a laugh, it was a low, eerie sound, like he was mocking me. "You think I'm gonna get out? After all this?" I looked at him again, this time fully aware of the danger. He wasn't planning on leaving. I knew it then, but I wasn't sure what to do. "You need to get out," I said again, my voice firm, but my heart was racing. But now he just grinned. It was a slow, deliberate smile, and something in it made me want to vomit. "You don't get it, do you?" "I'm not getting out," he said. I was trembling now, but I wasn't about to let him have control. I quickly reached for my phone, planning to call for help, but before I could do anything, he reached across the seat and grabbed my wrist. His fingers were like iron, digging into my skin. "You can't just call someone," he hissed. I yanked my wrist away, my mind racing. I had to think fast. I couldn't let him control this situation. I focused on the road, trying to remain calm, even though panic was rising inside me. I remembered the gun I kept in the glove box. I had never used it, but I had it there for situations like this. He must have seen the shift in my expression because he leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "You think that'll help?" he whispered, his breath hot and rank in my face. But before I could react, I saw the lights of another car in the distance. Relief flooded me, and for a split second, I thought I might get out of this alive. The car was close, and I steered toward it. My foot slammed on the gas, and I cut across 2 lanes to get behind the other vehicle. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the hitchhiker still watching me, his eyes burning into the back of my skull. I wasn't safe yet, but I was getting closer. I couldn't go back to the road we'd been on, but I could keep driving. I had to keep driving, away from him, away from whatever the hell he had planned. When I finally found a gas station and stopped, I jumped out of the car, locked the doors, and ran inside. I didn't stop until I was inside, safe. The stranger never followed me inside, but I swear I saw him standing outside in the rain, watching me through the window. I was driving back home from a weekend trip. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. The sun had set a while ago, and the highway stretched ahead of me, an endless dark ribbon through the middle of nowhere. I knew I needed gas, so when I saw the lights of a small rural gas station in the distance, I pulled off the highway. The station was old, run down, and mostly deserted. There was one car parked near the pumps, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed the clerk inside, a young woman in her late 20s maybe, but she looked off. Her movements were jerky, like she was too tired or nervous, and she kept glancing out the window at the car with tinted windows. I tried not to think too much of it. I got out of my car, stretched, and went over to the pump. The woman inside watched me from behind the counter, her eyes wide, but not in a welcoming way. She was looking at me like I was a threat or something, which I thought was a little strange. But I wasn't about to get into a whole thing over it. I filled up my tank, and then I went inside to pay. When I opened the door, the bell above it gave that hollow ding, and the woman looked up sharply. She was standing at the counter, fiddling with something, but her hands were shaking. I didn't say anything at first. I was just trying to get in and out, you know? But then I noticed something odd. There was a man standing near the corner of the store, just outside the light of the counter. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and I could barely make out his face. I'm not sure why, but he just gave off this weird vibe, like he wasn't supposed to be there. The woman behind the counter was watching me. Her eyes weren't even looking at the register. She was looking at me, but then her gaze flicked quickly toward the man, and she gave me this very quick, very subtle nod, like she was trying to warn me. It was so fast, I almost didn't catch it. But something in her eyes made me realize she was in some kind of trouble. I took a step back, trying to figure out what was going on. I could feel my pulse pick up a little, the way your body does when something feels off. The man in the corner hadn't moved, and now I noticed he was looking right at me. It was a strange stare, like he wasn't just looking, but he was sizing me up, studying me. My instincts told me I should just pay and leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing at the woman behind the counter. She looked panicked, like she hadn't expected me to ask her anything. She froze for a second, and then she gave me a quick, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The man didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for something. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the buzz of the gas station's air conditioning, but otherwise, it was eerily quiet. Are you sure you're okay?" I asked again, now trying to make sure I wasn't making the situation worse. That's when the man took a slow step forward, not toward me but toward the counter. His hands were in the pockets of his hoodie, and his posture was strange, relaxed, but also like he had control of the situation. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Then the woman behind the counter spoke. I need to get my purse," she said quickly, her voice shaky, and she rushed toward the back of the store, past me. "Hold on," I called, but she didn't stop, disappearing into the back room. I wasn't sure if I should follow her or not. I just stood there for a second, unsure of what to do, when I realized the man had started to move toward me. It was slow, deliberate, like he was walking toward me just to see how I would react. He wasn't coming for me, but he was making it clear that I wasn't in charge of the situation anymore. I thought about bolting for the door. I honestly considered running, but something in my gut told me that would make everything worse. I glanced toward the back room, where the woman had gone. It was so quiet. I felt like I was stuck between two bad choices, not sure what would make it worse, staying still or running. Then, just as I was about to make a decision, I heard the woman's voice from the back. "You need to leave," she said, her tone cold now, but there was something in it, fear, maybe, but also urgency. She wasn't just telling me. She was telling him. The man stopped dead in his tracks, and for a second, I thought maybe he would leave. But then he tilted his head slowly toward the back room and gave a slight nod. It was too calm, too controlled. It was like he was waiting for something. "Leave now," she said, her voice shaking. The urgency in her voice now was clear. I didn't know what was going on, but my instincts kicked in. I turned and walked toward the door, trying to keep my movements casual, but inside, I was terrified. The last thing I heard before I reached the door was the man's voice. It was low, like a warning, and all he said was, "I'll be right here when you get back." I didn't turn around. I didn't even look back through the glass as I quickly pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cool night air hit my face, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't that bad. But then I saw the woman in the window, watching me, her face pale and strained. I got in my car as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop driving until I found another gas station, miles down the road, where I pulled in and called the police. I didn't want to believe that something bad had happened, that I had narrowly avoided something dangerous, but in my gut, I knew I hadn't just imagined what had happened. I was still rattled hours later. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed the woman's look, or if I'd ignored it. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me. And I'll never forget the woman's eyes, pleading for help that never came. I hope she's okay. It started around the middle of the week. I remember because I had just finished my homework and was sitting by the window, mindlessly staring out at the street. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so when a car parked across from our house at almost the same time every evening, I thought it was odd, but not enough to be concerned. It was a plain sedan, nothing special. Just sitting there, headlights off, engine running low. The first couple of nights, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe the guy was waiting for someone, or maybe he was just passing through. But as the days went on, I started noticing patterns. Same car, same time, same spot. And every time I glance outside, the guy would still be sitting there, not moving. It was weird. On the third night, after the car had been there for about an hour, I decided to take a look. Maybe I'd been watching too much TV or reading too many crime thrillers, but something didn't sit right. The way he just sat there, not getting out, not doing anything. It bugged me. So, I decided to go outside and walk by the car. Not obvious, just acting casual, pretending like I was walking the dog. When I got closer, I saw the man more clearly. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had a scruffy beard, the kind of guy who looks like he's been awake for too long. He had a cigarette in his hand but wasn't smoking it. He was just sitting there, looking straight ahead. I couldn't even tell if he was staring at something or just zoned out. I passed the car, trying to act normal, but I couldn't help glancing over. As I did, he turned his head and looked directly at me, locking eyes for a moment. It was only for a split second, but something about it made my stomach drop. It was a strange, cold stare, almost like he was sizing me up. I quickly walked back to the house, my heart beating a little faster than normal. By the time I got inside, I told my mom. She didn't seem too concerned. She said maybe he was just waiting for someone. That was probably the case, she told me. People wait around all the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days, the same thing happened. Same car. Same time. Same man. By then, I was getting paranoid. I started watching him more closely, especially when it was getting late, just before the streetlights turned on. Every night he'd be there, sitting in the dark, waiting. The pattern was becoming too obvious. On the fifth night, I decided to confront him. I had to. I couldn't just keep watching from the window. I needed to know what he was doing, why he was sitting outside our house for hours on end. It was around 10:30 when I saw his car pull up again. The same sedan, the same man. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my coat and went out the front door, walking straight toward the car. I kept my steps slow, not trying to look too eager, but my heart was racing in my chest. I tried to act like I was just walking down the sidewalk, like I wasn't about to do something crazy. When I got to the car, I stopped just short of the curb, standing a few feet away. The man didn't notice me at first. He was staring out the windshield again. I cleared my throat, loud enough for him to hear me. He looked up, and for a second, his eyes widened, like he didn't expect someone to approach him. But then he relaxed, almost like he was relieved. He put the cigarette out on the dashboard and rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and calm, like he wasn't concerned at all. I nodded, swallowing hard. "You've been sitting here every night. What are you doing? Waiting for someone?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes shifting slightly, like he was trying to read me. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I'm waiting for someone," he said slowly, his voice strangely flat. "Someone who doesn't live here." I froze for a second, not sure what he meant. The way he said it was so odd, like there was something more behind it. I felt my stomach churn. "Who?" I asked, trying to sound confident even though my heart was pounding. He shook his head, just a small movement, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Doesn't matter," he said. "They're not here. But I'll wait." I didn't know what to say to that. I couldn't just stand there and keep talking to him. I didn't want to make him angry. I could already feel the tension between us, like something was about to snap. "All right," I said, backing away slowly. "But I don't think you should be sitting here. It's weird." He just nodded like he understood, but the look in his eyes made me think he didn't care at all about what I said. As I turned around to leave, I could feel his gaze on me. It stayed on me the whole time I walked back to the house. I went inside and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still watching. It felt like he wasn't going to leave, no matter what. Every night after that, I kept an eye on the street. The car was there, the man was there. I never saw him leave, not once. Eventually, after a few more days, he stopped coming. But by then, I was too shaken to feel any relief. I kept thinking about what he'd said, how he was waiting for someone who didn't live here. It wasn't just a weird comment. There was something off about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. After that, I didn't tell anyone else about it. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I never stopped checking the street when it got dark. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there, waiting. And what would have happened if I hadn't confronted him. I've never been one to feel uneasy while hiking. It's something I've always done alone, enjoyed the quiet and the solitude. That day, I was on a trail I'd walked many times before. It wasn't the most popular, so I usually had it to myself. The weather was perfect, and I was making good time. I remember feeling a strange sense of peace as I hiked, the kind you only get when you're surrounded by nature, completely cut off from everything else. I hadn't seen anyone for over an hour, so when I noticed a figure up ahead, I was surprised. It wasn't too uncommon to pass another hiker, but there was something about this guy that made me pause. He was standing just off the trail, almost like he was waiting for me. I slowed down and started to step off the trail when I saw him wave. I waved back, trying to keep things casual. I figured he was just another hiker taking a break. When I got closer, though, he smiled at me, and it didn't feel right. Something in his smile felt off, like he wasn't just friendly. He was studying me, sizing me up. "Nice day for a hike," he said. I nodded and said, "Yeah, perfect weather." He didn't move out of the way, so I had to step around him. As I did, I felt his eyes follow me, and I got a chill. I didn't want to engage, but he spoke again before I could continue. "Where are you headed?" he asked. I could feel my guard going up. I didn't know why, but I instinctively didn't want to tell him anything personal. I kept walking but said, "Just up the trail a bit." "You know, the usual." I figured that would end it. But no, he started walking beside me. "By yourself?" he asked. I wasn't sure how to answer that. Something about the question felt intrusive, like he was testing me. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone short. He didn't seem bothered by my response. Instead, he seemed pleased. "I like to hike alone, too. It's peaceful, isn't it? You get to clear your head." I couldn't understand why he was still walking with me. I didn't know him, and I definitely didn't invite him to join me. I wasn't sure if it was the way he was smiling or the way his gaze lingered, but something was definitely wrong. "Are you from around here?" he asked. I tried to be polite, but my patience was wearing thin. "No, just visiting. I'm staying nearby." "You live alone?" he asked, his voice lowering like he wanted me to tell him more. His tone made my skin crawl, and I was starting to feel trapped. "No," I said firmly, "I'm just here to hike. I'd prefer to do it alone." I picked up my pace, hoping that would give him the hint. But he matched my pace effortlessly, almost too easily. "I know the area pretty well," he said, his voice still too calm. "If you need company, I can show you a shortcut. It's safer with someone else, you know. You can't be too careful these days." I stopped in my tracks and turned to face him, finally fed up. "I'm fine. I don't need a shortcut. I'm not looking for company." He didn't stop smiling, but something shifted in his eyes. "You sure about that? You look like you could use someone to talk to." His persistence was starting to make me nervous. I could feel my heart rate pick up, but I didn't want to let him see I was uncomfortable. I started walking faster, hoping he would take the hint. But instead, he did something that made my blood run cold. He didn't fall behind, he sped up, moving in front of me. I stopped, taking a step back. "Where are you going?" he asked, blocking the trail. His smile faded, and his eyes seemed too intent now, too focused. "I think I've had enough for today," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'll head back to the parking lot." He didn't move. "You don't need to leave so soon," he said, still blocking my way. His voice had an edge to it now, something I hadn't heard before. "I thought you were enjoying the hike." "I was," I said, my voice tight. "But I think I'll go now." Something in his demeanor shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel the danger in the air. It was like a switch had flipped, and now he wasn't just a person I had to get rid of, he was a threat. "I think you should stay," he said, a little too slowly. He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He wasn't just some friendly hiker anymore. He was closing in on me. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted, running down the trail as fast as I could. My breath came in sharp gasps as I pushed myself harder, knowing he was probably right behind me. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my ears, getting closer with every step. I didn't dare look back. I kept running until I reached the clearing where the parking lot was visible in the distance. The guy was no longer following me, but I wasn't sure if I was just outrunning him or if he'd stopped. I made it to my car in a few minutes, almost hysterical with relief. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and jumped into the driver's side, locking the door. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't want to see if he was still there, watching me. I just kept driving, fast, not caring about the turns or the speed limit. I wanted to get as far away as I could, as fast as I could. When I finally got back to my place, I didn't stop driving until I was inside my apartment, double-checking all the locks before I sat down to catch my breath. It took me days to shake the feeling of that man's eyes on me, his smile. The way he wouldn't leave me alone, no matter how many times I told him to. I've learned since then to trust my instincts. When something feels off, you listen. And that day, I didn't. I worked the night shift as a janitor in a big office building downtown. The kind of place that's never really empty, but there's nobody around at night except for me. The building is old, probably from the 70s, and it creaks a lot. The whole place is quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I've always gotten used to it. One night, things started getting weird. I was on the top floor, doing my usual rounds, mopping the halls when I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning kicking on or maybe a rat, but then it came again, a low thud followed by something that sounded like dragging. I froze, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. I figured maybe one of the workers had left something behind, or maybe I wasn't the only one left in the building. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was alone on the upper floors, so I wasn't too worried. I went down the hall, following the sound toward the old elevator shaft. It was dark back there, not the kind of place anyone would typically go. The elevator was out of service, but there was a maintenance room nearby with an old key I had from when I started working there. I used it to open the door and turn the light on, half expecting to see an open window or a draft causing the weird noise. But there was nothing like that. The room was just filled with old equipment, and the walls had a layer of dust on them. No signs of anyone being in there. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from above. I looked up toward the ceiling, trying to figure out what could be up there, and that's when I saw something strange. The old air vents were covered in what looked like footprints. I froze again. I knew for a fact nobody had been up there. The building had been locked up for weeks, and the upper floors were completely unused. But someone had been up there recently. The prints led up toward the ceiling, like someone had climbed inside the vent system. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another prank. Maybe some college kids had gotten in somehow. I walked back toward the stairwell, feeling uneasy. The elevator shaft was right next to the stairs, and as I turned the corner, I saw something move. It was a person. A man. He wasn't in a uniform or anything, just a regular guy, but he was moving in a way that made me uncomfortable, slow, almost like he was trying to be quiet. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing there, but I froze. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I quickly ducked around the corner, holding my breath. I heard him stop for a moment, and then the footsteps started again, this time closer. It was then that I realized he must have been living up there. I could hear him shuffling around, like he was rummaging through something. I felt a wave of panic rush through me, but I didn't know what to do. I wasn't trained to handle situations like this. I slowly backed up toward the stairwell. The last thing I wanted was for him to know I was there, but I was so scared that I accidentally knocked over a mop bucket. It clattered loudly against the tile floor, echoing down the hall. The man froze. I didn't wait for him to make the next move. I turned and bolted for the stairwell. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed to get out. I could hear him coming after me, his footsteps slapping against the linoleum, getting closer. I slammed open the door to the stairwell and ran down, 3 floors at once. My heart was racing, my mind telling me to go faster, but I couldn't get my legs to move any quicker. I reached the ground floor and ran straight to the front desk. The night security guard was there, sitting behind the desk, but his back was to me. I was out of breath, trying to explain what happened, but he didn't seem concerned. "There's no one up there," he said, turning around to look at me. "What do you mean there's no one?" "I just saw someone," I said, my voice shaking. He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Maybe a homeless person snuck in through the back. We've had a few of them before." I didn't know if I believed him. I didn't know who to trust anymore. But I didn't want to stick around to find out. The next day, I called the building manager and told him about the footprints and the man I had seen. He didn't seem to care much either. He said the place had been empty for a long time and that they had already hired security to handle the situation if anything unusual came up. I thought about what would have happened if I had been too slow or if the guy had caught me. I haven't been back to the top floor since that night, and I've heard from other janitors that they've been noticing strange things too. We all keep our distance from the upper floors now. I don't know who was up there, or how long they've been living in the building, but every time I hear a strange noise late at night, I remember the feeling of being watched from the shadows. It still keeps me up sometimes, wondering if they're still there. I don't know why I remember everything about that night so clearly. Maybe it's because it was the last time I ever went to a party like that. Or maybe it's because what happened still feels unreal, even though I know it happened. I'm not really a party person, but I went because a few friends from work were going, and I needed a break from the usual routine. You know how it is, you get tired of the same old thing and want to mix it up. It was a house party, nothing special, and it was already past midnight when I arrived. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a group of people having drinks, playing music, laughing, that kind of thing. The house was in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, far enough from the main strip to be isolated but close enough that people could walk there if they wanted to. The hosts, a couple of guys I didn't know that well but had met through my friend Jake, greeted me at the door. They were in their late 20s, a bit younger than me, but they seemed friendly enough. I said my hellos and stepped inside. The place was packed, there were at least 20 people. Everyone was talking, laughing, dancing, and the music was loud. The usual party vibe. At first, everything felt normal. I grabbed a drink and joined the crowd near the back, just people watching mostly. After a while, I started to notice someone who didn't fit in. He was standing off to the side, not talking to anyone, just watching. I'm not sure why it stood out to me at first. He was dressed in dark clothes, not formal but also not like the casual partygoers. He had a serious expression, almost like he wasn't there to have fun, just observing. I didn't think too much about it at the time. Maybe he was just a quiet guy, or someone who didn't know anybody but still came anyway. But there was something strange about the way he stood. It wasn't the usual kind of wallflower thing where someone just hangs back and doesn't engage. This guy didn't just look bored or awkward. He was scanning the room, his eyes moving fast, from person to person, always looking. It was as if he was taking inventory of everyone there, and that made me uneasy. I saw him a few more times throughout the night. He never moved from his spot near the edge of the room, but he was always watching. It was like he was studying us. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself I was just overthinking it. People get weird at parties, right? Maybe he was shy, maybe he was drunk and just zoning out. But the way he never interacted with anyone, how he just stood there, watching, made me feel like I wasn't imagining it. Around 2 a.m., the music started to get louder, the crowd started to get rowdier, and I figured it was about time to head home. I didn't know anyone very well at the party, and I was starting to feel like I was just standing there, staring at the same faces for hours. As I turned toward the door to leave, I saw him again, still in the same spot, still looking. But this time, something was different. I walked toward the door, but I noticed out of the corner of my eye that he was moving. He didn't walk like someone who was just heading for the kitchen or to the bathroom. It wasn't like he was casually making his way across the room. It was like he was following me without actually moving toward me. I didn't know why, but I could feel his eyes on me. I glanced over at him, and our eyes locked for just a second. I can't explain what happened next. I wish I could. I don't know why it suddenly felt like I was the one being hunted. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, so focused, so intent, like he knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. I kept my gaze on him for a moment too long, and then I turned back to the door. I was almost out of the room when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. I felt him close, too close, and I knew he was following me. I kept walking faster, just trying to get out. My heart was pounding in my chest. My hand was on the doorknob when I heard his voice, soft but unmistakable. Leaving so soon? I froze. It was him, right behind me. I didn't turn around to answer. I could barely even breathe. I wanted to bolt out of that door, but I was paralyzed. "Why don't you stick around?" he said again, quieter this time, almost like a suggestion. It wasn't threatening, not in a direct way, but it was so wrong that it made me sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just turn around and face him. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from showing just how scared I was. Instead, I twisted the knob and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop moving. I walked as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I made it to the sidewalk, and I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder. I didn't see him right away, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. I kept walking, faster now, not caring that I was probably drawing attention from anyone who might be nearby. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but it was too quiet. I didn't even stop to check if he was still inside. I didn't care. I got to my car, got inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while, trying to calm myself down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. It felt like he was still watching me, even though I couldn't see him. I couldn't shake that feeling, not all the way home. I never went back to another party like that. I don't know what that guy's deal was or why he was there, but I haven't seen him since. Every time I hear a knock at my door late at night, I freeze. The memory of his voice, his presence, has stayed with me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did, but I know I don't want to find out. It was a little after midnight when I got to the gym. I'd had a long day at work, and I wanted to blow off some steam. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. There was one guy on a treadmill when I arrived, but he left after about 20 minutes. By then, it was just me. I liked the quiet. I didn't have to wait for machines, and I didn't have to deal with anyone taking up space by scrolling on their phone. The gym wasn't huge, just a single floor with a weight section in one corner and cardio machines in another. The locker rooms were in the back, and there was a staff desk near the entrance. I did my usual routine, some bench presses, a bit of time on the rowing machine, and a lot of focus on the free weights. I lost track of time, like I always do. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when I decided to wrap up. My arms were sore, and I figured I'd done enough for the night. When I grabbed my water bottle and towel, I noticed the place was eerily quiet. More than usual. I hadn't seen the staff member in a while, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they'd step out for a smoke or to grab something from the back office. I walked to the front door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. It was one of those heavy glass doors with a magnetic lock that needed a keycard to open. I assumed my keycard just hadn't scanned properly, so I swiped it again. The reader beeped, but the door stayed shut. I tried a few more times, each swipe followed by the same beep, but the lock didn't release. I looked around for the staff member, but the desk was empty. I knocked on the door in case they were outside. No one came. My phone was in my gym bag, so I pulled it out to call the number posted near the desk. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the system was down, and the staff had stepped out. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd wait a bit and they'd come back. I sat on one of the benches near the free weights and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, almost like I imagined it. A heavy breath, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere near the back of the gym. I froze, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the air conditioning. Then it came again. Louder this time. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark corner near the locker rooms. The lights in that area were dimmer than the rest of the gym, but I could just make out the shapes of the lockers and the doorway leading to the bathrooms. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. I told myself it was probably just the air vents or something falling over in the locker room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I took a few steps toward the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Is someone there?" I asked. This time, I heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty gym, coming from the direction of the locker rooms. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, looking for something to defend myself with. The best I could find was one of the metal dumbbells. I grabbed it, the cold weight steadying my shaking hands. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a staff member playing a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in and was messing with me. Or maybe it was something worse. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark corner. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low and quiet, almost a chuckle. It didn't sound right. There was no humor in it, just something wrong. I backed away, keeping the dumbbell raised in front of me. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cracking. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, and I told the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since I was in a more remote area of the city. I kept the operator on the line as I moved toward the front of the gym. I could still see the dark corner out of the corner of my eye, but whoever was there hadn't moved again. The operator told me to stay on the line and try to find a safe place to wait. The staff desk had a small storage cabinet underneath. I crouched down and wedged myself inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering updates to the operator. Then the footsteps started again. Slow and steady, moving closer to the front of the gym. I clutched the dumbbell tighter, my breath shallow and fast. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the sound of those steps. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look down and see me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They headed toward the glass doors. I peeked out from the cabinet, just enough to see a figure standing there. The light from the street lamps outside cast their shadow across the floor. They stood there for a moment, their back to me. Then they turned their heads slightly, like they were listening for something. I ducked back into the cabinet, squeezing my eyes shut. A loud bang echoed through the gym. I jumped, hitting my head on the top of the cabinet. It was the front door. The figure was slamming their shoulder against it, trying to break it open. I told the operator what was happening, my voice barely more than a whisper. They assured me the police were on their way. The banging stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the weight section. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. The figure froze, then bolted toward the back of the gym. I stayed in the cabinet until I heard the sound of voices calling out, telling me it was safe to come out. The police found no one in the gym. Whoever it was must have slipped out through an emergency exit before they arrived. They checked the security footage, but the cameras in the back corner had been tampered with. I haven't been back to that gym since. I canceled my membership the next day. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel that same icy fear, like they're still there, just waiting. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies of water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it, we were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark. We'd all gone out camping to this spot one of us had found online, tucked way back in the woods off some dirt road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a clearing near a stream with enough space for our tents and a small fire pit. There were 5 of us, me, Mark, Julia, Chris, and Mia. We'd set up camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner over the fire, and stayed up for a while talking and laughing. The woods were quiet that night, just the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. It was peaceful. We all went to bed around midnight. We were packed into 2 tents, me, Mark, and Chris in one, and Julia and Mia in the other. Everything felt normal. I don't know what woke me up, but when I opened my eyes, it was still dark. It had to have been early morning. The air felt colder, and the fire outside had burned down to just embers. Mark was snoring quietly next to me, and Chris was still, too. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out why I was awake. Then I noticed it, a faint sound, like something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, soft but close. I held my breath and strained to listen, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I told myself it was probably an animal. This was the woods, after all. I rolled over and eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up again, it was because Mark was shaking my shoulder. The sun was just starting to come up, and the inside of the tent was dim, but I could see the look on his face. He looked uneasy. "Chris isn't here," he whispered. That woke me up completely. I sat up and looked over at where Chris had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was unzipped and empty, his boots gone. I figured maybe he'd just gotten up early and gone to the stream, but Mark's expression made me pause. We got out of the tent and found Julia and Mia already up. They were standing near the fire pit, which Julia had started again. Both of them looked worried. Julia was holding her arms around herself, and Mia was pacing. "Chris isn't here," Julia said, her voice low. "We've been calling for him." The woods felt different in the morning light. The trees that had seemed comforting the night before now felt too close, too thick. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. We all started calling Chris's name, walking in different directions but staying within earshot of each other. There was no answer. After about 15 minutes of searching, Mia called out for us to come to the edge of the campsite, near the tree line. Her voice had a strange tone to it, and I felt my stomach twist as I jogged over to where she was standing. She pointed at the ground. At first, I didn't see what she was looking at, but then I noticed the disturbed dirt and leaves. There were marks, faint but clear enough to tell something had happened. The dirt was scuffed up like there had been a struggle, and there were deep impressions in the ground where someone had fallen or been dragged. And then there was something else. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was small, just a strip, but it was the same color as the jacket Chris had been wearing. No one said anything for a moment. We just stared at the ground and the torn fabric, the reality of it sinking in. Something had happened to Chris. He hadn't just wandered off. Mark broke the silence first, saying we needed to look farther into the woods. I could tell he was trying to sound confident, but his voice was shaking. We split up into pairs, Mark and me going one way and Julia and Mia going another. We didn't go far, just enough to scan the area around the campsite. None of us wanted to go too deep into the woods. As we searched, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. The woods were too quiet. There should have been birds, insects, something, but there was nothing. Just us. After about an hour, we regrouped back at the campsite. No one had found anything. No tracks, no sign of Chris. We were all tense, speaking in short, clipped sentences. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The sense of fun and adventure was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear we didn't want to admit out loud. Mia wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Mark argued that we couldn't just leave Chris behind. Julia agreed, but her voice wavered when she spoke. None of us knew what to do. We didn't have cell service out here, and the nearest town was miles away. It felt like we were completely cut off. As we debated, a sound broke through the silence, the sharp crack of a branch snapping. It came from somewhere just beyond the tree line. All four of us froze, our eyes darting toward the direction of the sound. "Chris!" Mark called out, his voice loud and shaky. There was no answer. We waited, holding our breath, but the woods stayed silent. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Mia grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark looked torn, his gaze shifting between the woods and the rest of us. Finally, he nodded. "Let's pack up." "Now!" We moved quickly, throwing our gear into our backpacks with shaking hands. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, hidden just out of sight. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see someone or something step out. But there was nothing. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, none of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, weighed down by the fear we couldn't shake. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees. When we finally reached the cars, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made me dizzy. We threw our packs into the trunks and got in, locking the doors. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We reported Chris missing as soon as we reached town. Search teams were sent out, but they never found him. The official story was that he must have gotten lost in the woods, but none of us believed that. Not after what we saw at the campsite. Not after hearing that sound. I don't know what happened to Chris that night, but I still think about it. About the torn fabric. About the marks on the ground. About how close we must have been to whatever or whoever took him. I've worked the night shift at St. Margaret's Hospital for almost 2 years, and it's never been anything out of the ordinary. Sure, the night shift can be slow, sometimes even eerie, with fewer staff and fewer patients. But you get used to it. The routine, the silence, the dim lighting, all of it. You learn to move through the quiet halls without thinking too much about it. But this past month, something changed. Something that made me start questioning everything. It started with the missing medical records. At first, I thought it was just me being forgetful. I'd file a chart, go back to check on a patient, and then realize I'd left something behind. But over time, it wasn't just one or two records, it was entire files, crucial ones. The kind you need to monitor a patient's care. Every time I went to grab one, it was gone. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, the computer, but nothing. I didn't mention anything at first, thinking maybe someone else had misplaced them, or I had simply put them somewhere without realizing it. But then it started happening with other things. Missing equipment, syringes, medication. It was as though something or someone was taking things. And the weirdest part? Every time I asked my colleagues about it, they seemed just as confused as I was. One night, things took a much darker turn. It was around 3 a.m., a quiet time when most patients were asleep, and there weren't many staff around. I had just checked on the last few rooms of my floor when I noticed that Dr. Patterson, the head of our unit, was walking down the hall. Now, Patterson was a bit of a strange one, distant, always a little too formal, and he never worked nights. He'd always been a day doctor, so it was odd to see him at this hour. Dr. Patterson? I called out as he passed the nurse's station, just to be polite. He stopped for a second, then turned to me with a blank look. "Oh, it's you, Nurse Williams. How's everything tonight?" His voice sounded fine, but there was something off about it, like he wasn't entirely aware of where he was. "It's going all right. Everything under control?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He nodded slowly, almost too slowly. "Yes. Everything is fine. Everything is always fine here." It was a strange thing to say, considering how late it was and how empty the hallways felt. But I didn't think much of it at the time. The next time I saw him, it was a few hours later. I had just finished my rounds and was sitting at the desk, catching up on some paperwork. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate. I looked up, expecting to see one of the night staff coming through. But it was Dr. Patterson again, walking with that same eerie calmness, his eyes scanning the hallway as if looking for something or someone. This time, I couldn't help myself. "Dr. Patterson, is everything okay?" I asked, a little too forcefully. He turned to look at me, and his eyes seemed to flicker for a moment, like he wasn't really seeing me. He gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is fine. You should check on room 205. The patient in there seems restless," he said. His voice was almost mechanical, like he was repeating something he'd been told to say. I gave him a nod, but something in my gut told me something was very wrong. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to check the patient in 205. So I did. When I reached the door, I felt a cold chill. The lights in the room were dimmed, and there was no sound coming from inside. The patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawkins, had been admitted for severe complications due to a stroke. She was never very mobile and often slept through the night. But when I opened the door, she wasn't in the bed. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains. Still nothing. But when I looked down at the floor near the window, I saw something strange, a small smear of blood leading from the bed toward the door. Panic set in. I immediately checked the security footage, but the cameras outside the room had been disabled. I felt my pulse quicken. How could the cameras have been turned off? And why would they even be disabled at all? I went straight to the head nurse's office, but she was nowhere to be found. It was just me, and the feeling that something was seriously wrong, and I couldn't shake it. I rushed back to the nurse's station, where I found another nurse, Carla. She looked just as confused as I felt. "I think Dr. Patterson has been doing something to the patients," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Mrs. Hawkins is missing, and the cameras." "Carla, something is wrong." Carla froze, staring at me. "What are you talking about? Are you sure?" "Check room 205, I urged. "I don't think she left on her own. There's blood on the floor, and I can't find her anywhere." She seemed reluctant, but she finally nodded, and we both went to room 205 together. When we got there, we saw the same thing. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed, and the blood smear on the floor. But then, when Carla turned to me, her face paled. "Where is Dr. Patterson?" I looked around. He wasn't there, but I had just seen him a moment ago. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of dread. Carla and I decided to check the hospital's basement. We didn't say a word as we descended the stairs, but the deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The basement was where all the medical waste and old equipment was stored. It was also the last place I wanted to be at 4 a.m., but something in my gut told me to check. We turned the corner to find Dr. Patterson standing by a door, a heavy metal door I had never noticed before. His back was to us. He was mumbling to himself, as if he were talking to someone. "Dr. Patterson?" I called out. He didn't respond. I looked at Carla, and she looked back at me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Slowly, I approached him, and I could feel the air growing colder. "Dr. Patterson, what's going on?" I asked again. This time, he turned slowly to face me, his eyes dark, empty. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Behind him, the door creaked open. I didn't wait for him to move. I grabbed Carla's arm and pulled her back toward the stairs, ignoring the scream that built up in my throat. We ran out of the basement, all the way to the front desk, and the first thing I did was call 911. When the police arrived, they searched the basement and found a small, hidden room. Inside, there were medical records, patients' belongings, and enough evidence to show that Dr. Patterson had been conducting some sort of illegal experiment. It didn't make sense. He was manipulating patients' files, drugging them, and somehow making them disappear. He had been using the cover of the night shift to do whatever he was doing down there. I never went back to work after that. The hospital was investigated, but I don't know if anything truly came of it. I didn't stick around to find out. I couldn't. I don't know what happened to Dr. Patterson. I never heard his name again, but every time I see the hospital on the news, I wonder if someone else will find out what he was doing. I don't think I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I know this. I'll never forget the cold emptiness in his eyes. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a 2-car garage, a couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, a couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. Maybe they forgot about the appointment. Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. "Neither am I," I replied. But I wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. "I think we should check it out." "What?" Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm not going first." We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us, or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic, almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. "We need to leave now," I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope you'd use to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. "This is all wrong," I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. "We need to call the police. This place it's a trap." As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone, but the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. "What the hell?" The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of the house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about the house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap, or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure, we were lucky to get out of there alive. I didn't think it would be anything serious. Just a weekend camping trip with a few friends. We'd gone to the same spot a couple of times before, remote, quiet, and far enough from the usual crowds that it felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. I'd always loved the woods. The peace, the stillness. It was my escape, my reset button. The first day was just like any other. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening talking and joking around. Nothing unusual. The night was cool but comfortable, and after the fire died down, we all settled into our tents. I remember hearing a few animals in the distance, but nothing that seemed alarming. It was a typical night in the woods. But the next morning, when we woke up, things felt a little different. We'd all gotten up early to cook breakfast. It was still quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every twig snap and every breeze rustle through the leaves. As we were eating, one of my friends, Danny, pointed out something strange on a nearby tree. It looked like a symbol, carved into the bark, about the size of a dinner plate. It wasn't a typical mark you'd see from the natural wear of the forest. It was too deliberate. Too clean. "Is that a symbol?" Danny asked, squinting at the tree. We all stood up and walked over to take a closer look. It was a series of lines that crisscrossed in an almost symmetrical pattern. The lines weren't deep, but they were noticeable enough. The kind of thing you'd have to work at to carve into a tree with something sharp. "I've never seen anything like it," said Sarah, another friend. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the marks. "It's definitely not just some random scratch." We stood there for a minute, unsure what to make of it. There wasn't any obvious explanation for it. None of us had done it, and none of us thought any other hikers would leave a mark like that. It didn't feel right, but it wasn't something that screamed danger either. Maybe it's just some weird tree carving, I said, trying to brush it off. People carve things all the time. But Danny wasn't convinced. He looked around at the trees nearby. You guys don't think there's more of them, do you? It didn't take long for us to find more. They were scattered all around our campsite. Not on every tree, but enough that you couldn't ignore them. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence, but the further we walked, the more frequent they became. And the marks started to look different, like they were changing. Some of them were jagged, while others were smooth, almost as if the person carving them had gotten better at it. The lines became more intricate, more deliberate. The last mark we found, just past the edge of our campsite, was the most unsettling. It was carved into a massive oak tree, and this one wasn't a simple symbol. It looked like a crude face, deep, angular lines, and what could have been eyes and a mouth. A face that seemed to be staring right at us. I don't like this, Sarah said, her voice shaking. This isn't normal. Danny stood frozen, his eyes wide. We should leave. Right now. I agreed, but I didn't want to show it. The air around us had shifted. It felt thicker, like something had been watching us. The woods, which had once seemed inviting and peaceful, now felt oppressive. Heavy. And the symbols, they didn't feel random anymore. We should get back to camp, I said. Maybe pack up, go somewhere else. But just as I turned to head back, I heard something. A rustling. Not the wind. Not an animal. It was too deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the brush. We all froze, listening. It came from further down the trail. A crunch of leaves. A snap of a twig. Then, silence. Did you hear that? I whispered. Danny and Sarah nodded, their faces pale. Someone's out there, Danny muttered. We didn't move for a while. The woods around us seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I said, we need to get back to camp. Now. We started to walk quickly, but as we did, I noticed something else. A set of fresh footprints on the dirt trail. They were wide, heavy steps, not like any of ours. And they weren't there when we'd first walked by. The footsteps led away from the camp, deeper into the woods. But they didn't look like they belonged to anyone hiking casually. They looked purposeful. Like someone had been walking, watching, waiting. Do you think someone's been following us? Sarah asked, her voice cracking. I don't know, I said, feeling the pit in my stomach grow. But we need to get back. We picked up the pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. It was like there was someone just out of sight, keeping pace with us. The rustling. The footsteps. It was all too close. We finally made it back to the campsite. But as we approached, we all froze in our tracks. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. The symbols. They were closer now. Carved into trees that hadn't had marks on them before. More importantly, they were different. They weren't just random symbols anymore. They seemed to follow a pattern, one that was starting to feel intentional. The last tree near our campsite, the one right next to the fire ring, had a symbol that was unmistakably a hand. A hand with fingers spread wide, as if reaching for something. My heart pounded in my chest. We need to leave. Now, I said, my voice hoarse. But before I could say anything else, I heard it again, the rustling, just off the edge of the camp. And this time, I could see something moving. It was too much. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Get the gear. We're leaving. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed what we could, sleeping bags, food, anything we could carry, and we ran. As we scrambled to pack everything, I couldn't help but glance back at the trees. I swear I saw a figure, standing just beyond the firelight, watching us. It was gone as soon as I looked directly at it. We didn't stop until we reached the car, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We didn't talk much on the way back, but the silence between us was enough. The woods, the symbols, the footprints, all of it had felt like a warning. A warning that someone or something had been watching us. The next day, we reported what happened to the ranger station. They took our details, but when we asked about the symbols, the ranger just looked at us like we were crazy. No one else had reported anything strange. But I know what I saw. We all know what we saw. Those marks on the trees were no accident. And whatever or whoever was out there was watching us. It happened last summer, during a trip I'd been looking forward to for months. There were 5 of us friends who'd known each other for years, and this was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from everything. A weekend of hiking, campfires, and just getting away from the noise of life. We had picked a remote spot for our campsite, a place that wasn't far from a scenic lookout. We set up camp and spent the day hiking to the spot, taking in the view, talking about everything and nothing. It was beautiful, the kind of place where you could just lose yourself in the moment. The weather was perfect, and everything felt right. That's why, when the time came to head back to camp, I didn't think twice about it. We started the hike back around mid-afternoon, all of us chatting as we walked, just like we had on the way there. The path was a little more challenging on the return trip, mostly downhill, but nothing too serious. Everyone was in good spirits, tired but happy. I remember feeling a little lighter, knowing we'd be back at camp soon, ready to relax and enjoy the evening. But then, when we reached a fork in the trail, I noticed that one of us, Tom, wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe he had just fallen behind, so I called out to him. "Tom? You good back there?" No answer. I figured maybe he had stopped to take a picture or rest for a minute. We'd been stopping here and there, so it wasn't unusual. I kept walking, thinking he'd catch up, but after a while, I started to get that feeling. You know, the one where something doesn't feel right, but you can't put your finger on it? I stopped again. "Tom?" Louder this time, more urgent. Still nothing. At this point, I turned around. I'd walked a little further than I realized. I looked down the trail, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no movement. It was as if he had just vanished. I started walking back in the direction we came from, calling his name, trying to keep my voice steady. The others had noticed by now, and they began calling for him too. We all split up, each of us taking a different path, looking for Tom. We didn't want to panic, but it was hard not to. We kept looking for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail leading off the path, nothing that would tell us where he'd gone. I was starting to feel the panic rising in my chest, but I tried to keep it together. Tom was a big guy, he could handle himself. Maybe he'd just wandered off the path a little bit. Maybe he'd been ahead of us the whole time and we hadn't realized. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew that if he was just ahead, he would have answered us by now. It wasn't until we all met back at the fork, empty-handed, that we decided to go back to camp. Maybe he'd gotten tired of searching and went back to wait for us. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, that gnawing unease that something wasn't right. The hike back to camp felt longer than it should have. Maybe it was the quiet that made it seem that way. The silence was unnerving. Not a single bird chirped, no wind rustled through the trees. It was dead still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. When we got back to camp, it was as if nothing had changed. The fire was still out, our deer was just where we'd left it. But there was something off. I didn't know what it was at first, but it hit me when I saw Tom's backpack still by the fire. His tent was still standing, his sleeping bag rolled up neatly inside. Everything was in place. Everything except him. We all stood there in silence for a moment, just staring at his stuff. No one spoke. No one wanted to. I don't know how long we stood there, but the quiet was suffocating. None of us wanted to go inside the tents. No one wanted to be alone in that silence, but we couldn't ignore it. There were 5 of us, and Tom was supposed to be with us, but he wasn't. We called out for him again, our voices echoing into the dark, but there was no reply. I know I should have been more logical, but everything inside me was telling me something was wrong. Something had happened to him. I thought about going back out to look for him, but the thought of wandering those woods in the dark alone was terrifying. We didn't have a lot of light left, and the idea of searching for him with no real sense of direction, it wasn't safe. We all just kind of stood there, not knowing what to do. We decided to wait until morning. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe he'd gotten lost or hurt, and he was trying to make his way back. We kept the fire going, our voices quiet, too aware of the silence around us. It felt like the woods were closing in, like we were waiting for something. No one slept. We stayed by the fire, huddled together, watching the shadows move in the trees. Every crackling noise, every snap of a twig had us on edge. The hours dragged on, and the darkness seemed endless. In the morning, we woke up with a sense of dread that had been building all night. The fire had died down to embers, and the sun was barely up. We all looked at each other, but no one wanted to be the first to speak. We were all thinking the same thing. Tom was still gone. We decided to check the trail again, this time sticking together. We retraced every step we'd taken the day before, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. But the trail was still empty. There was nothing. Not a single clue to where he'd gone. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, no broken branches. And that's when we noticed it, something I had missed the first time we walked back to camp. His gear was untouched. The same backpack that had been sitting by the fire the night before was still there. His sleeping bag, his boots, even his jacket, all of it was just sitting there like he'd walked off and forgotten to take it with him. But that didn't make sense. If he'd left voluntarily, why would he leave everything behind? The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Not even the sound of the wind. Nothing. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think we'll ever know. But I know that I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that didn't want us to leave, didn't want us to find Tom. The whole experience left me with more questions than answers. Tom never came back, and no one ever found any sign of him. It felt like he had just disappeared. To this day, when I think back on that weekend, I can't stop wondering, did we miss something? Or did we just make the wrong decision by staying? It happened a few months ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've told a few people about it, but I don't think anyone really gets how scary it was. I still don't fully understand how I ended up in that situation. It all started when I finished my work late one evening. I'm in marketing, and sometimes I'm stuck in the office for hours after everyone else leaves. It was around 11 p.m., and I just wanted to get home. Normally, I take the subway, but it was a Friday, and the trains always feel a little sketchy that late, so I decided to order a rideshare instead. I opened the app, booked a ride, and went outside to wait. I stood by the curb, scrolling through my phone, not really paying much attention to what was going on around me. I was tired and ready to get home. A few minutes later, I saw the car pull up. The app said the name and the car model, so I walked over to it and opened the door without thinking much about it. The driver, a man, looked a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He didn't seem unusual. He smiled at me when I got in, which I returned with a tired nod. He didn't say anything at first, so I just buckled my seatbelt and settled in, expecting to hear the usual small talk. But instead, he started driving without asking for confirmation or anything. It wasn't until we had driven for a few minutes that I noticed something was off. The route didn't feel familiar. I live in a part of the city that's pretty straightforward to get to from downtown, but we seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. I thought maybe he was taking an alternate route or something, but the streets were getting emptier and less familiar. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I had just misjudged the route in my tired state. But after about 10 minutes of driving down roads I didn't recognize, I started to get anxious. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond at first, just kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road. I tried again. "Hey, I think you missed my turn. Can you turn around?" That's when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "No, we're going the right way." I could hear a slight accent in his voice, but it was hard to place. His eyes stayed locked on the road. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Listen, I'm not sure where we're going, but I need to get home," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "Could you please turn around?" He glanced at me quickly, just a quick flick of his eyes, before looking back at the road. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll take care of it." I couldn't make sense of what was happening. At this point, I started to feel a little panicked. My phone was on the passenger seat beside me, and I considered texting a friend or calling someone. But something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to give him any reason to get more defensive or angry. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, passing familiar streetlights that grew more sparse the farther we went. The streets turned darker, and the buildings started to look less like the city and more like empty industrial areas. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is getting too far out. I need to go home." The driver didn't answer right away. The silence felt suffocating. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he said something so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "You'll be fine. Just relax." That's when I started to really panic. The rational part of me wanted to get out, but I didn't know where we were, and I had no idea if I'd even be able to get another ride back. There was nothing around us but dark roads. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. "Please let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "I need to get out of the car now." The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was aware of what I had said. He didn't speak for a long time, and I started to feel like I was suffocating in the small space. "Don't make this difficult," he finally said, his voice colder now. It was like a switch had flipped. "You'll get out when I say so." I couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. I was in a car with a stranger, headed somewhere I didn't know, with no way to get out. The panic hit me hard, and I started to think about what my options were. I could try to jump out when we stopped, but what if we were somewhere with no one around? What if he came after me? I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. The car slowed down, and I immediately braced myself. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't know if he was going to stop and let me go or if he was going to hurt me. "Stop the car," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Let me out right now." He glanced over at me again, but his expression hadn't changed. It was like he was enjoying my fear. "We're almost there," he said, as if I should just trust him. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone and started tapping furiously. I knew I had to make a call, even if it was just to alert someone to what was happening. I dialed 911, trying to keep my hand steady as the car turned onto an even darker road. Before I could say anything to the dispatcher, the driver jerked the wheel, making the car swerve slightly. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes with a menacing glare. "Hang up," he ordered. "Now." I didn't even think. I hit the red button to end the call. My heart was thundering in my chest. I had no idea if I had just made things worse or saved myself. I took a deep breath and tried to gather myself. I needed to act quickly. "Listen," I said, my voice much more firm now. "I'm going to call the police. You can't do this." He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. It was almost like he had made up his mind about something. Finally, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. "Get out," he said flatly. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, ran out of the car, and didn't stop until I was far enough away that I could barely see the car's headlights in the distance. My legs felt like jelly, and I was breathing so fast I thought I might pass out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I don't know if I'd be here writing this. But I never took a rideshare again after that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I've always enjoyed camping, hiking, being out in the woods alone. There's something peaceful about it, just being away from everything, surrounded by nature. But that day, everything went wrong, and I ended up lucky to be alive. It started like any other trip. I was alone, like I usually am, set up in a remote spot near a small lake. There's a trail that runs close to the campsite, but not many people use it. I had planned on spending 2 nights there, enjoying the peace. The weather was great, not too hot, and there was a nice breeze. I had everything I needed: tent, food, water, and some books to pass the time. The first day was perfect. I took a long walk in the morning, then spent the afternoon reading and relaxing by the water. I didn't see anyone. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. At dusk, I started a small fire and cooked my dinner. Everything was fine. The next morning, I woke up early, made a quick breakfast, and decided to go for a longer hike. There was a ridge I'd been eyeing from the lake the day before, and I figured I'd take a look at it. I packed my day bag, grabbed my water bottle, and headed out. The trail was narrow and winding. I was maybe an hour into the hike when I heard something. At first, it sounded like footsteps. But that didn't make sense. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I stopped, listening closely. The sound stopped too. For a minute, I just stood there, waiting. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, moving through the underbrush. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking. The trail curved around a cluster of trees, and that's when I saw him. A man, maybe 100 yards away. He was crouched low, moving quickly, and had a rifle slung over his shoulder. I froze, instinct telling me to stay still. I wasn't expecting anyone out here, and the last thing I wanted was to startle him. I should have turned around right then. I should have left. But for some reason, I didn't. I stepped off the trail to give him some space, but I didn't want to leave either. I wanted to get a closer look, see if he was just passing through or if he was hunting. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe I felt safe with the distance, but whatever it was a mistake. I had moved off the trail a little further, hidden behind a group of tall bushes, just enough that I could still see him. I was crouched low, watching, when he suddenly stopped, raised his rifle, and aimed. My heart jumped into my throat. My first thought was that he saw something. Maybe an animal. I thought maybe he was hunting for something, and I was just in the way. But then everything happened too quickly. The shot rang out. My body jerked in surprise, but the pain came right after. A sharp, searing pain in my side. I gasped, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed. I didn't even understand what had just happened. I had no idea what to do. I felt the blood seeping through my clothes, warm and sticky. The man, I don't know how, but he must have realized what he did, came running toward me. I couldn't even process what was happening. He was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out. Panic in his voice. He stopped in front of me and looked at me, his face pale as he stared at the wound. Shit, 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 he kept repeating. His hands were shaking. I was in shock, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to focus. But everything was spinning, and I felt so dizzy. I couldn't move. Could barely even talk. The man was still kneeling in front of me, his eyes darting around, like he was looking for something. For a second, I thought maybe he was looking for help. Maybe he called 911. But then he stood up abruptly, his expression shifting to fear. I didn't mean to shoot you, he said, his voice high-pitched. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed. Then he took a few steps back, glancing nervously over his shoulder. And that's when he did something I will never forget. He turned and started running. Just laughed. Without saying another word, without trying to help, without even making sure I was still alive. He ran back down the trail, leaving me there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't even fully process what had just happened. I remember hearing his footsteps getting farther away, and it hit me he wasn't coming back. I was alone. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was clutch at my side and try to stop the bleeding. I didn't know how long I'd been lying there, but I knew it was getting worse. The pain wasn't going away, and I could feel the blood soaking through my clothes, my hands slippery from it. I knew I had to move. Somehow, I had to get help. But I was in the middle of nowhere. The trail was empty. There was no one else around. The man had just left me to die. Somehow, I managed to drag myself onto my feet. It was slow, and the pain was unbearable, but I kept moving. I couldn't afford to lie there. I had to find my way back to the campsite, or at least to somewhere, anywhere with people. The trail felt like it went on forever, the trees around me closing in. It was hard to keep track of time. My vision was blurry, and every step felt like it might be my last. I don't know how, but after what felt like hours, I made it back to my campsite. I collapsed by my tent, my strength finally giving out. I could barely move anymore, and everything hurt so much I couldn't focus on anything. I don't know how long it was before someone found me. When they did, it wasn't a rescue team or the police. It was just a group of hikers who happened to be in the area. They called for help, and I passed out right then. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. The bullet had grazed my ribs and had gone through my side, but I was alive. Barely. As for the man who shot me, I never heard from him again. I don't know who he was. He never contacted the authorities, never reported the accident. I'm sure he thought he'd get in trouble for what happened, but he left me there, bleeding in the woods, alone. I never went back out into the wilderness after that. I can't. The thought of being that alone again, of depending on someone who would just leave me behind, it's too much. And I don't know if I'll ever understand how someone could do that. We've been driving for hours when the storm hit. The kind of rain that makes it hard to see anything beyond a few feet in front of you, and the wind that howled like it was angry at the world. My partner, Sarah, was behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep the car steady on the slick, winding road. I could tell she was getting frustrated with the rain, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it worse. It wasn't like we were in a rush or anything. We'd been taking the scenic route, trying to avoid the crowded highways, but now it felt like we were completely alone out here. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick woods on both sides, and there was nothing around for miles, no signs of life, no houses, no other cars. The occasional flash of lightning lit up the sky, but even that felt like it was miles away, swallowed by the storm. The rain was pouring down so hard that the wipers couldn't keep up, and the road was barely visible. I kept glancing at the side of the road, just trying to make out anything. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of debris, but as we got closer, I realized it was a makeshift roadblock. A bunch of thick branches and logs were piled up across the road, blocking our way completely. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, and I felt my stomach twist. "Sarah, stop the car," I said, my voice tight. "There's something in the road." She didn't need me to tell her twice. She slammed the brakes, and we came to a screeching halt. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and all I could hear was the pounding of it on the roof of the car. "Are you sure it's just debris?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Doesn't look like it." "Someone put it there on purpose," I said, my heart racing a little faster. "We should check it out." She didn't say anything. I could tell she was already getting anxious, but she pulled the car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. We both sat there for a second, staring out into the storm. "Stay in the car," Sarah said finally. "I'll go see if I can move it." I opened my mouth to protest, but she was already getting out, her door slamming shut behind her. I sat there for a moment, watching her, hoping she'd be okay. The rain made it hard to see much more than a few feet ahead, and the storm was only getting worse. The wind was howling, and it felt like the whole world was coming apart. I was already regretting suggesting we stop. I looked out the window and watched Sarah walk toward the roadblock. She had her coat pulled tightly around her, her head down to shield herself from the rain, and I could barely see her through the sheets of water coming down. I noticed her pause when she reached the logs, bending down to try to move one of the branches out of the way. But something didn't sit right with me. It was too quiet. No other cars had passed, and there was no one else around. I opened the door, just slightly, to get a better look. And that's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound. A few quick, muffled footsteps in the wet grass behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. It was so quiet for a moment that I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then I heard the sound again, closer this time. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the area, but there was no one there. Just the thick shadows cast by the trees, the rain, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating everything for a second before it went dark again. I should have stayed in the car, but something made me get out. I stepped into the rain, pulling my jacket tighter around me. I was about to call out to Sarah when I saw her standing there, motionless, staring into the trees. Her back was to me, and she didn't seem to notice that I'd gotten out. I felt a sharp tug of fear in my chest. Something was wrong. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaking a little. She didn't answer. I took a step closer, trying to ignore the cold feeling creeping up my spine. I wanted to call out again, but before I could, I heard the noise. Not from Sarah. From behind me. A low voice, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The trees swayed violently in the wind, the rain coming down in sheets, but no one stepped out from the shadows. I was sure I had heard something. Someone. I turned back to Sarah, my eyes scanning the area around her. And then I saw them. Two figures emerging from the trees, their silhouettes barely visible in the rain. At first, I thought they were just shadows, but as they got closer, I could see them more clearly. Two men, wearing dark raincoats, their faces hidden by hoods. They didn't seem to be in any hurry, just slowly walking toward us. "Sarah!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Get back to the car." But she didn't hear me. She just stood there, staring ahead, her face pale. The two men were almost to us now, and I could see the faint glint of something shiny in their hands, a knife, maybe, or something else. I couldn't tell. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. These weren't just people looking for help. I had no idea who they were, but I knew they weren't friendly. The first man spoke again, his voice low, dangerous. "We don't like people wandering through here." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you want?" "We're just passing through. We don't want any trouble." "Too bad," the second man said, his voice cold. "You should have stayed on the main road." My mind was screaming at me to run. But there was no way I could leave Sarah here. I had to get her back to the car. I looked around quickly, trying to find some way out, but I couldn't see anything. We were too far from help. The storm made everything disorienting. The men were closing in now, and I had no idea what they were planning to do. The first man raised his hand, and that's when I saw the knife. The glint of steel in the low light of the storm. I grabbed Sarah's arm as hard as I could, yanking her toward the car. "Get in the car. Now!" She didn't resist, but she looked confused, like she couldn't understand what was happening. I pulled her with me, her feet slipping in the wet mud, and we both tumbled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking, and I started the engine. The two men were still standing at the roadblock, watching us. They didn't move, but they didn't look away either. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the wet ground, but I finally got enough traction to back up. I didn't even check the mirrors, just slammed it into drive and sped down the road. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then, I don't think we ever really felt safe. I don't know what those men wanted, or why they decided to trap us there, but I'm just glad we got out. I never want to be that far off the beaten path again. And I sure as hell never want to come across a roadblock in the middle of nowhere, not knowing who's behind it. The storm passed, but the fear didn't.